Yeah, sure. If you, I will also share the links with you. If you want to put it on your web page, feel free to do it.
Okay, that sounds good.
So, Somendu, should we start?
In a minute, let it be like 6:30 sharp, and then we can start. Wait
Okay.
a few seconds, maybe.
I thought if I take one more minute, why should I cut that 1 minute from Mark's speech? Okay, no problem. Yeah, it's now 6:30.
So you want to introduce Mark? I mean, reintroduce Mark to.
Yeah.
Okay.
So now I'm going to formally welcome all of you to this evening session on the 4th day of our winter session. And amongst us, we again have Professor Mark Rosenzweig from Yale University. He is the Frank Atschel Professor of International Economics at Yale. He is also the Director of Economic Growth Center. He works, I mean, his workspace is too broad to describe, but I will just highlight a few bullet points. Agriculture is one of his primary focus areas, followed by development economics, economics of insurance, and migration. And interestingly, he presented a fascinating paper. In fact, 2 papers, presentations was based on 2 papers yesterday. I mean, according to him yesterday, for us today morning. And the topic was why the spatial mobility in India is so low. Today evening, this session, he is going to talk about are there too many farms in India and in the world? The farm scale and productivity revisited. And this is a joint work with Andrew Foster. So before I hand over to Mark, I just want to make a statutory announcement that we are going to take all the questions in the Q&A box preferred. Otherwise, if you are posting it in chat box, that's also fine with me. I will go through the questions and I'll put them up to Mark and time and again, if he agrees with that. And towards the end, we can have direct Q&A session if the time permits. Over to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. So this is a big question that's been around for a long time about the relationship between the scale of operation and productivity. And what I'm going to show you in this lecture is that the conventional wisdom on that relationship for low-income countries that has been around for over 70 years, but only 70 years, and I'll show you why it's 70 years, has been actually wrong and misplaced. And as a consequence, and when I say the conventional wisdom, I mean what all economists believe to be true based on evidence. And as a consequence, policymakers who rely on evidence are also wrong about their view on this question. Okay, so hopefully this will get your attention. All right, so let's start with the big question of, why are there these big differences across countries in productivity? And two reasons that have been highlighted in the literature is differences in access to technology. And in particular, we're going to focus on agriculture, that the differences in access of the technology of seeds and other aspects of production. And secondly, the misallocation of factors in low-income countries. Okay. Now, if we look at agriculture, I think it's fair to say that the access to technology is pretty open in the world. That in fact, the seeds in low-income country agriculture and high-income agriculture are the same. They're both using the latest technologically advanced seeds in the country. So for example, if we look at BT cotton, so this is cotton that's been genetically modified such that it repels pests, and therefore it obviates the need for pesticides. So it's more profitable for farmers, and it, in a sense, disregarding the technology of the gene replacement, it's a more organic and natural way of eliminating pests compared to using chemicals and pesticides. So if we look at the data, we see that 95% of all cotton grown in India is using this latest GMO cotton. 96% of the cotton in the United States, same cotton. It accounts for 4 million hectares of cotton in China, 2.6 million hectares in Pakistan. So all of these countries, low income, high income, are on the frontier in terms of seed technology. So it's not there that we should be looking at the differences. Okay, but there is one obvious salient difference between agriculture in low-income countries and that in high-income countries, and that's the scale of operation. I'm going to show you more statistics on this in a second. But for example, the average farm size in India is actually less than 3 acres, maybe just 2.5 acres now, because it's been declining for over time as we speak. And average farm size in the US is over 400 acres. So that's a substantial difference in the scale of operations. Okay, so a natural question would be, are farms in low-income countries too small? Which would mean, if so, that there are way too many farms that exist, too many farmers in these countries. And if that's the case, then the existing distribution of land represents a misallocation. And obviously the answer to this question depends then on scale economies. Now, we use data from India because it's really excellent, and I'll describe what I mean by excellent in a few minutes. But this issue about small farm size pertains to all low-income countries of the world, as I'll show you. Okay. Now we're going to look particularly at the productivity of farmland, but we're going to also look at output per acre of income per capita in agriculture as well, the marginal product of workers, et cetera. Okay. All right. Now I've mentioned that the thinking about this relationship between scale of operation and productivity has been wrong for over 70 years. Because if we go back to when India achieved its independence, there was a committee that was set up in 1947, the United Provinces Zamindari Abolition Committee, which was designed to consider how to break up the very large land sizes of the Zamindari. Okay, so they had to think about, okay, we're going to break up those big land sizes. What should be the size of the parcels? And what you can see from this statement by the committee is they identified the small size of Indian farming as the #1 impediment to achieving high productivity. Okay? And they thought that there ought to be some notion of a minimum scale of operation. And they decided that the minimum scale of operation would have something to do with the technology of farming. And so they determined that 10 acres was the appropriate minimum farm size for India, based on the idea that a bullock pair was necessary for operation, and that only a farm of 10 acres was consistent with the ownership of a bullock pair. Now, of course, they ignored labor costs, they ignored farm machinery, which wasn't prevalent in India at the time, but they had this idea that there was a minimum farm scale that would be optimal for India. And that, of course, compares to what the actual average farm size is in India, which is 1/3 to more than a third, less than a third of what they consider to be the minimum farm scale, right? So in fact, if we look at the trajectory of farm sizes in India, say from 1960, so that's already 13 years after the commission was set up, it's already less than 3 hectares in 1960. And by 2002, we see that it's about 1 hectare, which is about 2.5 acres of farm size, right? So that's the situation in India. The number of farms has doubled since 1960, more than doubled since 1960, and farm size has halved during that time. Okay, so what about today? What's the policy position in India today? Well, we have this quote from the Minister of Agriculture. And the Minister of Agriculture says that there's no evidence to suggest that small scale is a problem for Indian agriculture. Okay? And he's correct. This is what we'd like our ministers to do. We want them to look at evidence. And all the evidence in the literature suggests that this statement is correct. In fact, when you look at data from low-income countries, what you tend to find in almost all low-income countries is that there's an inverse relationship between the scale of operation and productivity per acre, however that's measured. And taking into account a whole array of different reasons why that would be true, it seems to be to exist in these countries. And I'll show you that. In fact, let's start with talking about, what are the global facts about agriculture? So I've already said that farming in low-income countries is small scale, and in high-income countries, it's large scale. So let me show you that for more countries. So we could take our 10 acres from the Zamindari Commission as our benchmark, and we can see that in the US and Canada, for example, there's very few farms, 10% of farms, only 10% of farms are less than 10 acres. It's 5% of farms in Canada. But when we look at countries like China and India, the Philippines, all these different countries from different hemispheres of the world, we see that the majority of farms, more than the majority of farms, it's almost 100% of farms in China, are less than 10 acres, right? So there's a massive difference in the distribution of farm scales across low-income and high-income countries. So that's the first fact about the world agriculture. And the second fact is that there are massive differences in the yields that we see from these countries. So let's take, for example, soybean yields. We see in the United States, soybean yields.
Can I interject?
Okay.
There is one clarificatory question from Saurabh Sarkar. What is the definition of farm size? Ownership level or,
all right,
or
I'll
plot
talk
level?
about that. I'll talk about that. Right. Okay. So let's we're going to talk about farm size. We're going to talk about lots of details here. Okay. So let me defer that here. Farm size is the operational holdings in this particular case of the farms. Okay. It's the sum of all of the plots of a farm. We're going to distinguish, I'll be very clear about this, between plots and farm sizes as well when we get to the specific data that we'll use. But here it's operational holdings of the farms. Okay. So if we look at the yields differences, we see that the yields for soybeans are 4 times what they are in Indonesia, in India, and the Philippines. And if we look at China, China doesn't look so bad. But it turns out that one of the reasons that the yields are higher in China is they way overutilize fertilizer. So this is fertilizer per hectare across these countries. And you can see that China is quite an outlier. It's a big problem in China. There's a lot of studies that talk about this issue. It has ecological problems as well. Okay. And the lesson from this is that when we look at output, we have to pay attention to the other inputs than land as well, which we'll do. Okay. Now, if we focus on India, it's not just soybeans. So it's rice, it's wheat, it's cotton. All these are far less productive in India compared to the high-income countries, the best producers in the world. And we already talked about how for cotton, these are the same seeds used in India as in these other countries. So these are comparable in terms of the seed technology, but of course the difference is the scale. Okay, the third fact is this inverse relationship. So this plots the relationship between either output per hectare or per acre, profits per acre, or rent per acre in 4 countries: Bangladesh, China, Indonesia, and Nigeria. Okay. And the x-axis is acres of planted crops. Okay. And it represents the full scale of operations in the countries. Okay, so for example, in Bangladesh, you don't see any farms above 20 acres. Okay, and across the full span of the scales of operation, you see this inverse relationship. This is in this case yields per acre in rice, kilograms per acre. In China, it's corn yields, and the span of operation is the full span of operations is up to 10 acres. Okay, and we see this inverse relationship. For Indonesia, it's rice yields per acre, and we have the full span up to 25 acres. And for Nigeria, it's at the plot level, and the full span of the sizes of plots in Nigeria is 5 acres. Okay, so for across all of the plots and farm sizes that we see in these representative data sets, so these correspond to what we would see in the population of farms in all 4 of these countries, we see this inverse relationship. So you can see, and I'll show it to you for India as well. So you can see that the Minister of Agriculture is absolutely right. When we look at the data, there's no reason to think there's anything wrong with very small farms. Okay. Now there's a 4th characteristic of farming in low-income countries, and that's the amount of farming that takes place without the farms using hired labor and without any of the farm members working off the farm for wages. So we call that autarkic farming. They're separated from the labor market, either as suppliers of labor or as demanders of labor. So for example, in the Nigeria data, 36% of the planting operations are autarkic. In China, which doesn't have operation-specific data, we have to look at the whole season, 17% of the farms over the whole cropping season are autarkic, neither selling labor nor buying labor. And in the data that we're going to use from India, the ICRISAT data, the International Crop Research Institute of the Semi-Arid Tropics data that I'll describe in detail, as I've said, 34% of the operations are autarkic. Okay, so autarkic farming is concentrated among the smallest farm sizes. Okay, and I'll show you why the existence of autarkic farms is important for understanding the barriers to productivity. And then finally, the last fact is that farming in high-income countries is not only large, but it's expanding in scale, and all farmers want to have bigger farms in these countries. And this picture sort of hints at what's going on. Okay. Now, the notion that there are too many farms doesn't just apply to low-income countries today. It also applied to the United States back in 1935, because we see in 1935, there was about 7 million farms. And since that time, the number of farms has diminished by 5 million. 5/7 of the farms were in surplus. And by surplus, I mean that despite this reduction in farm sizes, there's been a steady increase in output from farming. So there was not only a reduction in the number of farms, but because the total land in farming has not really changed very much since that time period of the peak number of farms, there's been a concomitant increase in average farm size, which is over 400, almost 450 acres on average for farms. Okay. So we saw that in India, there's a complete reversal of this, right? Over time, there's been an increase in the number of farms and a decrease in average farm size, just the opposite trends of what we see in a typical high-income country like the United States. Okay, and as I said, output has steadily increased. The real change has been the amount of labor that's used in farming. So there's a lot of savings of the resource costs to produce the output of farms in the US. Okay, so given the inverse relationship that we observe in low-income countries, it would appear that larger farms in low-income countries would be a misallocation. We actually want smaller farms. And of course, many land reform programs in low-income countries tend to reduce the size of farms, tends to break up larger farms. Now that has some equity advantages, and it looks like it's a win-win, because if we make farms smaller, according to that inverse relationship, it also will increase overall productivity. But all of this seems completely at odds with respect to what we see across the world, where we see that the largest farms in the high-income countries are much more productive than the average small farms in the low-income countries. So is it really plausible that there's overall scale diseconomies? And why do we just see them in low-income countries? What's going on? Okay, so this is obviously a big question. A large fraction of the labor force in low-income countries works in agriculture. It's 25% of the labor force in India. There's 119 million farms the last time I looked at the data. Okay. And this inverse relationship has led, obviously, to complacency about the existence of so many small farms and the consistent increase in the number of farmers in India. Okay, but on the other hand, if there are positive scale economies, this is a big problem. Okay. All right, so there are challenges to identifying scale economies, and the number one challenge is, as you saw in those 4 graphs that I exhibited, the scales of operations that you see in low-income countries are so far below the scales of operations you see in high-income countries that if there were positive scale economies, you couldn't see them because there are, in fact, no large farms. Okay. Now, there are other issues as well: plot size, plot quality. There may be measurement errors in plot size. We need to worry about whether the land allocation is endogenous, related to unobserved characteristics of farmers, ability of farmers to get credit, et cetera. So there are a lot of challenges to identifying true scale economies, but the key one is a data problem. Okay. And once we understand what the scale economies are, we need to understand what the source of the scale economies are. And in order to do that, it creates a lot of demands on the type of data that we use. Okay. Obviously, we're going to need a model to start with to embed our hypotheses about the sources of scale economies. And once we do that, as you'll see, it's going to create a need for some very detailed data that doesn't exist in most data sets of the world. Okay. So what are we going to do here? So first, I'm going to describe the data that we use, okay, and show the relationship in the data between profits per acre or output per acre and land size that we see in the data. And the data is going to have special properties. So what we're going to see is going to look a little bit different than what's seen with the standard data sets that exist in the world. We're going to assess whether the relationships we see is sort of spurious. It just has to do with differences in farm ability across farms or wealth across farmers that affect input costs, et cetera. We're going to see that labor market hiring costs are important. We're going to be able to quantify those. And then we're going to set up a model. And the model is going to incorporate 2 important features that the descriptive statistics suggest are important. The first is transaction costs and hiring labor. And the second is economies of scale in farm equipment. Then we're going to test the model. So it'll have implications that will provide that we can obtain from the model. We're going to test those. Okay. We're going to assess what the economies of scale and equipment are, and we're going to actually test for economies of scale. We're going to estimate the structural parameters that are relevant to equipment scale economies. We're going to focus on sprayers, and I'll talk about why we do that. Then we're going to calibrate the model. And in an equilibrium context where we can have labor exit from agriculture, that's going to enable us to identify the optimal scale of farms. We're going to do exactly what the Zamindari Commission did in 1948, where we're going to use the rigors of econometrics and better data and the existence of mechanization to do it what we think would be better and that they would agree is a good route to take. And when we have these calibrated fundamental parameters, we're going to carry out the counterfactual, very similar to the idea of what the Zamindari Commission did, of say, what would happen if we made all of the farms in India at the optimal scale that the calibration reveals? And let me tell you now in advance what we're going to show. We're going to show that the optimal farm size in India, given the existing technology in India, so not relying on importing large machines, or just taking into account what machinery and seeds exist in India right now, the optimal farm size is 25 acres. At 25 acres, that would represent that there's a surplus of farms of 83 million farms. So it represents an 87% reduction in the number of farmers in India, and a 16% reduction in the labor force. And the result of that, this is the important outcome, is a 42% increase in total output and a 68% increase in income per laborer in agriculture. So if this is correct, this is a big deal. This is not the marginal changes that we see from the now hundreds of RCTs that we see in low-income countries, which gets effects of 6% or 8% or 3% or 2%. This is a major impact, if it's true, okay? So, and in the conclusion, we'll discuss why it is that if it's true that there are positive scale economies, potential in India, why the farms remain small. I mean, what are the barriers to natural increases in farm scale, if this is correct? All right, so I'll start with the data that we use. This is the International Crop Research Institute Semi-Arid Tropics India branch. This is their really famous village level study data set. This was a survey that was begun in 1975 in 6 villages in the semi-tropic areas of India. And it's continued today. It's still ongoing. It's been in recent years supported by the Gates Foundation. We're going to look at a 6-year panel of farmers. And the panel is not just farmers, it's a panel at the plot level, covering the years 2009 to 2014, which were the latest years we could get a hold of. All these data are downloadable. Anyone can use these data. Okay. The data survey farmers in 20 villages across 6 states. There are 819 farmers here and over 2,000 plots. Okay. The data is in 2 parts. First is a complete census of all households in the 20 villages. So we can see exactly what the distribution of farm sizes are in those villages. And secondly, there's a sample taken of the farms and the landless labor households in these villages. And the first notable characteristic of this data set is that it stratifies by farm size. So it's not meant, the survey, to be representative of farms in even the ICRSAT villages. So in that sense, it departs from all the other data sets that you see. The censuses, the farm surveys in all other countries are meant to be representative of farms, okay? This, by stratifying by farm size, ends up oversampling large farms. They, in fact, pick 4 equal-sized groups. They divide into households that have no land, small farms, medium farms, and large farms. And each of these farms, there's a cutoff for each of those definitions, have an equal number of households represented in the survey. Okay. This is going to make a big difference because it's going to allow us to see larger farms in a data set than we would normally see in a representative data set. Let me make that clear here. All right. So this graph shows the cumulative distribution of farm sizes in the census, that is in the population of farms in the ICRSAT villages, and in the sample. Okay, so for example, the red line plot is the distribution, cumulative distribution from the census. And what it tells us is that if we look at 10 acres, that benchmark number, 90% of the farms, land holdings, operational land holdings, are below 10 acres. So that corresponds roughly to what's true in India generally. Okay. So if we wanted to look at the larger farms, they're only a small fraction if we had a representative sample of the farms that exist. On the other hand, when we look at the total land holdings in the sample, the blue line, we see that, in fact, 40% of the farms are above 10 acres. So we have a much larger fraction of farms to work with that are larger. And as we saw from the data sets from some of the other countries, there are no farms represented above 10 acres in 3 of those data sets. Okay, very few. All right. And then we also, as I mentioned, have data at the plot level. And if we look at the cumulative distribution of plot sizes, we see again that there's still about 20% of the plots that are above 10 acres. In Nigeria, you may recall, the largest plot size was 5 acres, right? We'd only see this part of the distribution. All right, so the first aspect of this data is we can actually see larger farms. All right. Now, another relevant aspect of these data is that there's a lot of detail about hours worked by laborers, which is going to be key to what we can do, which you don't often see in these agricultural data sets. Most labor is paid on a daily basis. And so when you look at data on wages, it's reported as daily wages in almost all data sets, including most Indian data sets. But it turns out that not all workers work 8 hours a day, as I'll show you. So this is going to be important as well. There's multiple measures of plot quality. We always have to worry about plot quality. The data are divided up into all the different operations that we observe. We have market input price schedules. We have information on how the plots were acquired. We have inventories of assets. And in one case, we can measure the capacity of farm machinery, which is going to be important as well. All right. So what do these data from ICRISAT show is the relationship between profits or output per acre and farm size. So if we look at the span of farm sizes, operational holdings across all of the plots, summed together across each of the farms, okay, across 95% of the farms in the ICRISAT villages using the census data, we see the inverse relationship. So there's nothing peculiar about the farms in these ICRISAT villages. The inverse relationship is there, okay, when we look at almost all of the farms that exist in the data. However, when we take advantage of the fact that we see a large fraction of larger farms and we expand our x-axis, this is what we see. It's U-shaped. We get the inverse at the small scales that we mostly observe in low-income countries, but we get increasing profits per acre for the larger scales. Okay, so the true relationship, which corresponds to what we see in the world, that is exhibited in the ICRISAT data is U-shaped. Low-income countries with the small scales exhibit the inverse. High-income countries at the larger scales exhibit the positive relationship. We have both represented in the ICRISAT data. So the challenge is not just to explain the downward curve, which is what has been the object studied by all of the researchers in the history of economics in low-income countries, but to explain the U-shape. And if we can explain the U-shape, we can understand better what the relationship is across the whole world, not just in low-income countries and not just in high-income countries. So that's the real challenge. So the first point is that the relationship is not just inverse, it's a U-shaped relationship. And only one other study that was done at about the same time as we started this study, done in an African country where they carried out a survey where they oversampled farm sizes, and they found exactly the same thing. They found that in the representative data sets from the same country, you saw only the inverse relationship, but when they expanded the proportion of farms that they surveyed that were larger, they found a U-shape. So this is not just India. All right, so now you're starting to think, all right, well, there could be other reasons than scale economies of some kind for the larger productivity of larger farms. And the first thing that we want to think about is maybe they're growing different crops across the different scales. So we can look at that in these data. let's take only cotton farmers. This is the relationship for cotton farmers. So all of these farmers are growing exactly the same crop, which of course BT cotton, as we've talked about. Now, if you look at soybeans, there are in fact no small farms using soybeans. So the relationship is actually just looks like this for soybeans. Okay. But there's some other issues. Okay. So there's maybe differences in land quality. And the primary one that most development economists would think about is, okay, the larger farms, they're wealthier farmers, they have better access to credit, they can finance more inputs, they're just using more inputs efficiently, they're not constrained, and so that's why they have profits per acre. So we have to deal with those two issues as well, the plot quality and farmer abilities, either just being more capable farmers or better access to inputs. Okay, so what are we going to do? Well, first we have 24 different measures of soil quality that we can use. Yes?
We have got 3 questions. I think you have already given partial answer to 2 of them. The one question is this, when you were talking about the output, so is it the output added up for different seasons?
Good. So we're looking at, in this particular case, Kharif, the main cropping season in Ickers. Good question. Yes, for the main agricultural cycle.
Okay. And another question is basically, what part of the productivity difference can be attributed to the differences in input other than the seed quality?
Well, that's what we're going to look at, right?
Okay.
Right now, the whole point of this paper is to understand the differences. Okay, and so that's what we're going to look at. We're going to answer that question in high detail, right? That's the challenge. We have to understand the source of the U-shape, costs of inputs, types of inputs, etc. Okay.
And also, whether will you be talking about the regional differences in the productivity?
No, because we're looking at ICRSAT data. So then there's semi-arid tropics.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Fine.
All right. So, but the region, this is a good question, because when people talk about the regional differences, they're talking in particular about differences in the quality of soil, for example, that exists across India, and maybe weather conditions, right? So we have to worry about, even within this ICRSAT area, that some of this U-shape may just be due to an association between the quality of the soil and the scale of operation. And as I was saying, we have, this is an agricultural data set. ICRSAT, this is a farm operation, has very detailed information on the characteristics of the soil. So we can measure our way out of that. Okay. All right. So let's look at these 2 issues: quality of the soil and farmer capabilities. Okay. So this plots the relationship between real profits per acre using the full span of the data in the ICRSAT data, always looking at the Kharif season. Okay. The red line is what I showed you before. It just reproduces that, right? This is the U-shape that we see up to 22 acres. If we expand it out, you'd see it go on. Okay. The green line is the U-shape that we observe when we take into account the 24 different soil qualities. Okay. And what you can see in the difference between the green curve and the red curve is that does eliminate a lot of the advantage of the smaller farms. So some of this advantage is spurious. It's just that it turns out that the smallest farms tend to be have higher quality soils. Okay, but even when we control for soil quality, we still see the U-shape. Now the blue line exploits differences across the scale of plots for the same farmer. Okay, so this is the relationship between profits per acre by the scale of plots within a farmer. This means that it's farmer fixed effects, so that there's no relationship between the size of the plots and the amount of resources the farmer has at his command. the amount of resources that he could borrow, or the farmer's ability. That's held constant. And what you can see across the plots of different scales, this is why it sort of ends at 18. They're not very large plots. You still see the U shape. So the point of this graph and the crop specific one, the cotton specific one, is to show that in fact the U shape is not due to differences in farmer ability or wealth. It's not due to differences in soil quality. It's not due to growing different crops. It's there. Okay. And so we need to understand what is going on. Okay. So let me say a little more. This is partly answers the questions that was asked about what we're measuring, and distinguish between plots and farms, as I already hinted this. So plots are the basic spatial unit of production for these farms. Plots are not choice variables here. Farmers are not choosing plots. They're not choosing plot styles. So in 2009, there's information in the data set about the source of the plots that the farmer owns. But in 2009, the data tells us that 85% of all owned land was inherited land. And that's true for the small plots and the large plots. Okay. Over the 6 years, 2009, 2014, less than 0.75% of the plot observations, okay, were purchased. Okay. Every change otherwise that we see over these years was again due to inheritance or gifts. Okay, so there's just no market that we see for plots and for land in this environment. And it's mostly true for India as well. So plot size doesn't vary from year to year. Farmers are not choosing their plots, right? We can take the farmer is stuck with the plots that he inherited, and he's working on those. Now, 43% of the sampled farmers own one plot. So that means the majority of farmers actually have more than one plot. Now, what's the operational scale that we should look at? Should it be plots or farms? Does it make a difference? Well, it turns out that we can look at the plot level if we want, because even within a farm, that is for the same farmer, they tend to treat the plots as if they were different farms. They do not synchronize the timing of operations across the different plots. So the synchronization of when an operation is initiated across a farmer's plots is no more than the synchronization across farmers with different plots for a different operation. And we can see that in the data. So this is the percent of operations that start on the same day across farmer plots by operation for farmers with 2 or more plots. And you can see that in almost no cases does a farmer, when he starts the harvest operation on a given plot, start the harvest operation on another plot that he owns. Okay, so we can, if we want, treat the plots as if they were separate farms, but operated by the same farmer. Okay, so here we go. How do we explain the pattern, the U-shaped pattern? Okay. So we're going to do that by specifying a model. And the model is going to incorporate 2 features. First, transaction costs of hiring labor. So those are travel and search costs. Okay. And we're going to show you that's going to result in falling average hourly wages with hours hired, and thus with plot or farm size. And then secondly, we're going to build into the model economies of scale and equipment, okay, both in terms of price and capacity. And the key part will be the capacity of machines. All right, so let me talk about labor market transaction costs. In the macro literature, they're always positing wedges, right? They make them up in order to fit the data. But here, we're in some sense doing the same thing. We're saying, well, there's these transaction costs. But I'm going to show you that we can actually measure these transaction costs, and they're not trivial at all. So the first characteristic of the labor market in agriculture in most low-income countries is that laborers, if they're hired at all, are hired on a daily basis for a specific operation. There are no long-term contracts. And this means that if a farmer wants to initiate a particular operation, he's got to, and he needs that family labor is insufficient to do the operation, then he needs to go into the labor market and find for that day a labor that is willing to work on the land. And so there's search costs, but there's also travel costs, that the laborers don't live right next to the farmer. Okay. And that we see that there's no relational contracting in another data set, the Economic Growth Center, Yale Economic Growth Center Tamil Nadu data set, where we see that on average, laborers work for 7 different farmers over the Kharif season. Now, it makes sense why there's no long-term contracting, because the farmers do not know in advance when they're going to carry out a specific operation over the course of the crop cycle. And that's because they don't know what the characteristics of rainfall will be over that crop cycle. So when they initiate the first operation, they don't know when they're going to need to have weeding. They don't know when they're going to need to put in fertilizer. It's all going to depend on the rainfall, which they cannot know in advance. Okay. Now, what about these travel costs? Well, the ICRISAT data provide us with information on the average distance between plot and homestead. Homestead's where they live. That's about 1 kilometer. Okay. And in fact, we have a satellite view of one of the villages. Okay. So you can see the village center. This is where the farmers and the laborers live. And all around the sort of village center are the farms. You can see the little farms all around. Okay. So a farm operation may take place here. That's on average 1 kilometer from where the farmer lives. And that farmer with a farm here has got to find laborers somewhere from the village. But the village doesn't define the labor market. In fact, the labor market extends beyond the village. What the Tamil Nadu survey tells us, which is a survey of 200 villages in Tamil Nadu, is that almost a quarter of the laborers report working for a farmer located outside the village. The farmers themselves tell us that over a fifth of the laborers they hire come from outside the village. And what we see among the workers who travel by foot or bicycle to another village, the average distance there is 2 kilometers. And then there's a whole set of workers, more than a quarter, more than 30%, who travel by bus, and the average distance there is 8 kilometers. Right? So there's a lot of travel costs involved in contracting on a daily basis with labor. Okay. So the ICRISAT data, as I mentioned, provides us with information on the hours worked of laborers that are hired. And what you can see for hired male workers, same for females, and for hired bullock pairs and drivers, while the majority of work is done for 8 hours, there's a big mass of workers who are working less than 8 hours. Okay? So it's not true, despite the fact that wages are paid on a daily basis, that all workers are working full-time during the day. This is going to be important, okay? Because it turns out we can compute what the fixed cost must be from our measures of the hourly wages implied by the daily wages using the hours that are actually worked. So there are 2 sources of these data from the ICRISAT data set. The first is price schedules by operation by month for daily wages paid and typical hours worked by laborers. Okay, and then in the survey itself across the farms, we see from all the input information, the amount of hours that are worked and the wages that are paid by day for these workers. Okay, so we can compute the hourly wage by dividing hours into the daily wage. Okay, and when we run simple regressions of the log of wages with fixed effects for operations, take into account that, of course, wages are going to differ across operations. So this is all within operation estimates. We look at the hourly wage that's paid for workers that work 8 hours or more, mostly 8 hours, versus workers that work less than 8 hours. And what we can see is the computed hourly wage for full-time workers, 8-hour workers, versus part-time workers on the day is a 33% discount. So the hourly wages are a third less for the full-time workers than they are for the part-time workers. And this corresponds exactly across the input survey data for the 3,400 operations that we see, and for the monthly price schedules where we have 729. We have a 22% discount for full-time bullock pair driver operations, and 30% from the input survey. For sprayers, by the way, we don't see any discount depending on how many hours a sprayer is used. Okay, so it matters whether you're using part-time workers or full-time workers. We can also look at whether it makes sense, okay, whether these discounts are related to, in fact, distance. So in fact, we find that it's true that for plots that are of longer distance from the homestead, the discount is even greater for part-time, for full-time workers, right? Compared to when they're not, when they're closer to the homestead. All right, so what does this imply for the fixed costs? Okay, well, the estimates with these discounts are consistent with the existence of fixed hiring costs. Let's suppose that employers in equilibrium that want to employ workers, even for a few hours, have to compensate the workers for the costs that they incur for coming to the plot. Okay, so that our wage payment is going to be a fixed cost plus a marginal wage that's associated with the number of hours that are worked. Okay, so the W1 is the marginal hourly wage, W0 is the fixed cost. So if that's what defines the wage schedule, then given our estimates, okay, we can actually compute what the fixed cost W0 must be. So we have the average wage for part-time workers, which is going to be the sum over the 7 hours of part-time work for the different wages that are paid across the distribution of those hours, okay? And we have the wage rate for full-time workers, which can go from 8 to 12, it's mostly 8, okay, that we get from those regression estimates. We get that the average part-time wage is equal to 1.347 times the average wage paid to full-time workers. We know that the marginal wage is 21 rupees. We get that from the wage schedule. We just look at the increment in the daily wage for a worker working 8 hours versus a worker working 9 hours. Okay, that's 21 rupees. So we know W1. We know the differences in the average wages for part-time and full-time, and that yields an estimate of the fixed cost of 178 rupees. That represents over half of the cost of the daily wage for a full-time worker. So these transaction costs, as revealed from the data, are far from trivial. They're really important. So if you're a farmer that has a scale of operation that doesn't need full-time workers, that hires part-time workers, you're actually paying a higher cost per hour than a farmer who has a larger scale of operation and can therefore use the full-time workers. Okay, so you already see a hint at some of the reasons for why scale can make a difference. Okay, all right. So the transaction costs are important. We're going to embed them in the model. Okay, we'll do the model in 2 steps for heuristic purposes. We'll first have a model in which the only input is labor, but that incorporates the transaction costs. The relevant unit is the operation, because the operations are segmented. Farming is segmented into a sequence of operations. So for each operation, we need to use inputs to carry out the operation, whether the operation is applying fertilizer or applying seeds or tilling the soil or plowing or harvesting. That's what we mean by an operation. To simplify, we'll just look at one operation, but it can be easily extended to more than one operation. We do that in the appendix of the paper. And I'm going to show you in this model, with labor being the only input, but that incorporates transaction costs, we can obtain the U-shape, okay, in a particular way. After we look at that model, we're going to add to the model machinery capacity that's heterogeneous. And when we do that as well, we're going to generate a U shape that looks like what we observe in the world. For very low scales, we get the inverse, but as that we increase the scale, we get an ever increasing productivity per acre. Okay. So as I said, we're going to simplify, we're going to work with a one task, one operation, one period agricultural production technology. Now, we're going to assume that the agricultural production function, that is the relationship between inputs and output, is constant returns to scale. So we're not going to sort of magically assume that there's anything fishy about the technology of agriculture. Now, if you think about it, okay, if we double land size and we double the seeds and we double the nutrients for the seeds, including rainfall and sunshine and fertilizer and whatever, okay, it's hard to believe that you wouldn't get double the output. Right? It just would seem to be silly to say that the basic operation of farming is has inherent scale economies to it. It doesn't. Okay, so that's not where the answer is, about sort of magically assuming that the Cobb-Douglas production function or the CES production function has some kind of economies or diseconomies of scale. Okay. So the basic agricultural production function, to really simplify what agriculture is about, has two basic inputs: land and the nutrients to the seeds, E. Okay, so basically agriculture is seeing to it that the seeds get nutrients. The nutrients that you might like to control are rainfall with irrigation. You can feed them with fertilizer, and you're going to get rid of the competitors to those nutrients for the seeds that you care about, which are weeds. You're going to make sure also that the pests are not attacking the plants. Okay, so what we need to talk about is what determines the application of the nutrients. And so we're going to have a plant nutrition production function, which, as I said, is only going to involve labor. Okay, and that production function is itself constant returns to scale. So the nutrients are just going to be a function of family labor and hired labor. We're going to assume they're equally productive. Okay. So far, we're not introducing any kinds of artificial scale economies into our production technology. Okay. So now each worker we're going to take into account is only willing to work at most some LMX hours, maybe 8 hours, 9 hours, something like that. Okay. So we need to take into account, of course, that a farm might be hiring more than one laborer, which they might, so if they need, for example, 11 hours of work and workers are only willing to work 8 hours, they're going to have to hire 2 workers. So we're going to have to elaborate our wage price schedule, okay, with a ceiling function. The ceiling function is very simple. It says that if what's in parentheses is lower than the next digit, then we move up to that high digit. Okay. So for example, if a farmer needs 4 hours of work, okay, so this number is 1/2 because at most a worker will work 8 hours. Okay. He has to pay the full fixed cost for that worker. So he's going to pay W0 plus the 4 times the marginal wage for 4 hours of work. If the farmer needs to hire 11 hours of work, okay, so 11 over 8 is less than 2. So we move up to 2. He's going to have to pay 2 times the fixed cost, assuming you don't hire workers in teams. We're going to check that out when we do the calibration, and then pays 11 hours at the marginal wage. All right, so that's the basic wage price schedule. Okay. So farm profits then are just total output, which is a function of those inputs. Okay, there's constant returns to scale, so it's output per acre times the amount of acreage. They pay a wage rate depending on how many hours of labor are hired. And then there's an opportunity cost to family labor, which is going to be the marginal wage. Okay. Each farm has a fixed amount of family labor. Okay. And the farmer's programming problem is to maximize profits and the whatever labor earnings the farm members earn by working outside of the market, subject to the constraint that off-farm work and work on the farm can't exceed the amount of labor that's available from family workers. Okay. All right, so that's it. That's the model. Okay. Transaction costs, labor use, constant returns to scale technology. Okay, so let's see. Does it yield the U? Okay. So it turns out there's going to be three regimes from this model that characterize the use of family and hired labor, and they're going to be there two thresholds that define those regimes. So let's start with the very smallest farm sizes. Okay, at the very smallest farm sizes, they're so small that the family labor, you don't need the family to work full-time on the farm. So family workers will work both on the farm and off the farm, which is what we see in the data. Okay. And of course, they don't need to hire any laborers because the family, the plots, the farm is sufficiently small that the family laborers that exist can optimally farm for that farm. Okay. So now as we move from the smallest farms and we keep increasing farm scale, we're going to reach a threshold A star, at which now all of the time of the family members is devoted to working on the farm. Okay. Now we increment the farm size above the threshold A star. And in order to maintain the optimal labor to land ratio, the farmer should hire additional workers. But he only needs, at that very small increment in increase in land, say 1 hour. But the farmer is going to have to pay that transaction cost W0 to hire that worker. And it compares the profits of the farm, hiring that worker and paying that fixed transaction cost, with the profits of the farm. If he doesn't bother to hire the worker, it pays for him, in fact, not to hire the worker. Now, as we continue to increase the farm scale, and the farmer makes that comparison, it's still true that it's not profitable for him or her, although we know most farmers who make farm decisions in India are men, that to hire labor. Okay, so as we increase farm scale above A star, the labor land ratio is now decreasing from the optimal, and therefore output per acre is decreasing. Okay, we continue to increase the farm scale until we reach a threshold A double star, in which case now it does become profitable to hire labor to increment that labor land ratio to be close to the optimum. Okay, and so the fixed costs are still going to have to be paid, and that's going to impact profits. But as farm scale continues to increase, the fixed cost associated with labor diminishes as a proportion of the total cost of the farm, and therefore profits per acre begin to increase. Okay, so we can define what the farm output looks like at A star, that first threshold that defines where the farm has fully exhausted family labor and now begins to need to hire additional labor. Okay, so regime 2, that regime in which the farm size is larger than A star, and the farm could use more labor but doesn't because the fixed transaction costs, is a farm that's in autarky. None of the family workers are working off the farm because they're spending full time in the operation, because they need to maintain that labor land ratio. Okay, but the farm is also not hiring labor because the fixed transaction costs make it unprofitable to do so. Okay, so the regime of autarky goes from A star to A double star, where it finally becomes profitable to hire labor. All right, so what does that look like? Well, do a simple simulation. Assume the Cobb-Douglas technology with a labor share of 0.5. Assume W0 is 2, the marginal wage 0.5, fixed cost of labor is 2, etc. 2 family workers, and this is what you get. So at the lower farms, as you increase scale, that just means that more of the family labor is devoted to on-farm work, and the land labor ratio is constant across the farm scales till you reach A star, in which case as scale increases, the land labor ratio the labor land ratio continues to diminish, which means the farm becomes less and less productive until finally you reach a double star where it becomes profitable to hire labor. You can now increase the labor land ratio and farm profits begin to rebound because the fixed labor costs are becoming a smaller proportion. Okay. Now, in this model, it means that the very largest farms at best are going to be just as productive as the very smallest farms. That's it. So it doesn't do the full job of having this upper tail have continuing increases in profitability above the smallest farm scales. Okay. So you get the U shape, but it has a limit to the productivity of farms. And there would be no reason then, if this is all that's going on, to advocate that farms should be bigger, because the smallest farms here are the most productive farms. Okay? We can explain the inverse relationship and we can explain the U shape from transaction costs, but we haven't licked the problem that the very largest farm seems to be even more productive than the smallest farms. Okay. All right, so this is just, okay. So now to do that, we're going to add machinery that's heterogeneous in capacity. So a lot of the literature in labor economics pays attention to the fact that labor is heterogeneous. But in fact, in almost all of economics, there's very little attention to the heterogeneity in capital. And that's because almost all data sets, it might even be safe to say all data sets, don't describe anything about the capital, about the machinery that's used. Even the agricultural data sets might name the machines. So they might say thresher, they might say tractor, they might say harvester. Okay? But that's it. They don't tell you anything about a crucial feature of those machines, which is their capacity. Okay? And I'm going to show you that capacity is the secret behind the issue of farm scale economies at the upper levels. All right. So a key distinction for machinery is the distinction between the time the machine is used, the tractor, the thresher, et cetera, the sprayer, and effective capacity. Now, effective capacity is the amount of processed acreage per unit of time. And effective capacity is going to depend both on the machine and farm size. And let me illustrate that in two ways. Okay. So there are 4-row harvesters and 8-row harvesters. An 8-row harvester can obviously harvest more per unit of time, twice as much as a 4-row harvester, right? Just by the nature of the capacity of the machine. Okay, so that's great. If you have 8 rows, you definitely want to get the 8-row harvester because you can cut down the number of hours that you need the machine. However, if you only have 4 rows, you can't take advantage of an 8-row harvester. So the capacity of the machine that's relevant for your scale of operation is going to be different depending on that scale of operation. Second example, power sprayer. So power sprayers can cover different radii. A high power sprayer might cover an area of an acre, say. A low power can only do 1/10 of an acre. But if you only got 1/10 of an acre, you're not going to use a sprayer that covers an acre, right? You'll be spraying your neighbor's farm as well. So we posit that there's an effective capacity function that's a function of the scale of operation, which has a positive derivative, first derivative, okay? That the larger the scale of operation, the larger the capacity of the machine that you can use, okay? Now, obviously, if pricing was linear, it really wouldn't matter whether you use a 4-row or an 8-row harvester, leaving aside the labor costs associated with driving the machine, okay? But so we're going to assume that the rental cost per unit of time R sub M, M is the time a machine is used, is equal to a base price P for a machine of capacity Q, and then it's a function of the capacity in a nonlinear way, where nu describes the nonlinear relationship between capacity and the price, the rental price of the machine. And as long as nu is less than 1, there are economies of scale in the capacity of machines in terms of costs. Okay? So far we have labor transaction costs, which affect the use of labor and the cost of inputs. And now we have nonlinear pricing in terms of the capacity of the machines. Now you can see that one would not be able to say anything about the pricing schedules from data that only said it's a sprayer or it's a harvester, right? We need actual information on Q, on what the capacity is of the machine. And even the ICRSAT data is mostly deficient in providing capacities. They say the farm uses a tractor, they say the farm uses a thresher, and that's it, okay? But we have one particular piece of machinery that we're going to be able to measure capacity indirectly, but appropriately, okay? All right, so before we get to measurement, we're in the model. We're going to elaborate the model now with the nutrient production function is now going to have both labor and machinery, and it's going to have to distinguish between the hours used on the machine, M, and the capacity of the machine. So we'll make it a CES production function. Delta is going to tell us the elasticity of substitution between labor L and machine time. It's going to incorporate the effective capacity function as a function of the scale of operation, and the omegas are just the shares of the two types of inputs. Okay, so we now have an input function which incorporates both labor and the machine capacity and machine time use. The hourly cost of machine now, we need to include that you need a laborer to run the machine. We'll assume that per hour of machinery requires a theta amount of labor to run the machine. It's usually a family member who does that. Okay, so the true cost of the machine is the rental price of the machine, which is a function of capacity, and the amount of time that you need a laborer to run the machine. That's theta is usually 1 in the data. All right. So now we augment profits to include the use of farm machinery, and we assume the farmer is again maximizing profits. Now, in this model, optimal machine capacity doesn't depend on the properties of the agricultural production function. It only depends on the cost of labor to run the machine and the base price and the pricing function and of course the effective capacity function. So in fact, the optimal Q is determined in this model by this first order necessary condition. Okay, you can see it has the pricing schedule in there as well as the fixed parts. And an interesting feature of this, which we're going to exploit later in the empirical work, is that the wage and the base price are additive to the rest of the expression. Okay? And second order conditions require that in fact nu be less than 1. All right. Now just from this model, we can obtain these comparative static results, which are fairly obvious, which is that as the scale of operation increases, capacity increases. And as the wage rate that you need to pay to run the machine goes up, you're going to increase capacity, okay, because you're going to cut down hours. All right. Now, the key difference between the labor-only model and the model that incorporates heterogeneous machinery is that you can get ever-increasing returns to scale above a certain threshold, okay? So when we do the same kind of casual simulation, which we'll do much more rigorously later, we can replicate the U-shape, okay? So this is what we got when we had only the labor inputs, and this is what we get when we have the labor inputs as well as the machinery inputs. Okay, so this is the role of inputs and input costs in yielding the U-shape. Okay. So before we calibrate and structurally estimate the model, we want to know is there evidence for this model? We want to test some of the mechanisms. Okay, so some of the tests that we're going to do is to look at the use of low-hour labor across farm sizes. And so let's get into that. All right. So the first thing we see is that when we go from the smallest scale of operation, an increment farm scale, farmers are going to be using more and more of the low-hour labor. Okay. And then eventually at a threshold, they'll stop, the amount of lower labor that's used goes down. Okay. So that's what we see in the data. That's consistent with our model. Okay. And as a consequence, the hourly wage rises with scale at low scale of operation and then falls. Okay. Because they're using more and more of this more expensive low hour wage labor. Okay.
Mark,
yes.
One relevant question here, which was asked by Garima. So is it that part-time worker or specialized laborers versus the full-time
everything
workers?
is done. Everything is done within operation, right? So, for example, let's take weeding, right? This relationship shows up within weeding. I don't think it's very likely that there's a specialized person to do weeding versus a non-specialized person. So I mean, it's a good question, but I don't think so. And it's very important that we do things within operation, because it's certainly true. If we didn't do it within operation, there might be specialized labor, across different kinds of operation. There might be someone who specializes in weeding, who specializes in harvesting or in plowing, et cetera, which is certainly true for plowing, but we're looking within operation. So I don't think that is what lies behind these differences. All right, so what we see is, in general, that what you see in the plot, these are just regressions that show that these relationships are significant, that as you increase a plot size on average, the fraction of operations that are less than 6 hours a day or 8 hours a day, you can use either one, goes down, and the hourly wage also goes down as a consequence for labor and bullock pairs. Okay, and however, we're still worried about this issue about the quality of plots. Okay, that all of this scale stuff could still be driven, despite the fact that we have this elaborate set of characteristics of plot soil quality, that there still could be this remaining relationship there. Okay, so we're going to do something tricky, which is we're going to use plot fixed effects, take advantage of the fact that the ICRISAT data provides a panel of plots for the same farmer. We can follow the same plot over time and look at the input use across the plots. Well, if we control for the plot, why is there variation in inputs? And the variation in inputs comes about from variation in rainfall. Okay? And what we would think is that if in a given year, on a given plot, rainfall is more ample, there's going to be more use of labor. So we can see at different plot sizes how rainfall affects input use. And the model says that the effect on the types of inputs that are used are going to vary for the same plot, depending on this the amount of the complementary input rainfall. Okay. So we could do year and plot fixed effects, but the key thing, so I'll first show you a linear specification, but then we'll look at how the effect of rainfall varies by plot size. So on average, what you'd expect, we can ignore the square term. It just shows that it's quadratic, but it never reverses the sign. So we can look at the linear terms. Okay, so as we would expect, on a given plot, if there's more rainfall, there's more labor that's hired. And that's statistically significant. This is a placebo. When there's more rainfall, you don't hire more tractor hours because the tractor is mostly used for plowing, and that occurs before rainfall is realized. There is a positive relationship between the rainfall for the same plot and the amount of bullocks, because they're used for more than just plowing. Okay, and as a consequence, on average, the average hourly wage is lower the higher is rainfall on average. Okay, the cost per hour of hired bullock pair is also lower on average. And our placebo, of course, there's no relationship between the hours of hiring a tractor and the price of the tractor. Okay. Well, the linear is not right. There's not the right specification. Our model says that, in fact, these relationships are going to differ by the size of the plot. Okay. So we're going to employ the locally weighted functional coefficient model for plot fixed effect to obtain plot fixed effects estimates of the effects of rainfall on profits and on input use, okay, by plot size. So first, this is the effect on profits. You can see it's basically linear. Across the different plot sizes, the more rainfall, this is the coefficient, okay? This is not the relationship between average profits and farm size. This is the magnitude of the coefficient of the effect of rainfall on profits. And what it says is that coefficient is basically the same across all plot sizes. And the red lines define the 95% confidence interval. All right, so that's not very interesting, but it shows what you would expect. All right, now our dependent variable is whether the operation is using low hours hired male labor, okay? So for small plots, the coefficient is positive, okay? So with the very small plots, when there's more rainfall, the farmer is going to hire more labor, but because the plots are so small, he's hiring more low hour labor because he doesn't have a plot size that's big enough to make it reasonable to use full-time workers, okay? But as we increase the plot size, the coefficient changes, and at the larger plot sizes, the coefficient is negative and statistically significant. It tells us at the larger plot sizes, when there is an increased demand for labor because of more rainfall, in fact, now at these larger plot sizes, they can use full-time labor, which is going to, so they're reducing the amount of use of part-time labor. And as a consequence, we see that at the larger plot sizes, as rainfall increases at larger plot sizes, average wage costs go down. Okay, and at the smaller ones, they're basically there's not much of a relationship. The key thing is that at the larger plot sizes, the costs of expanding operations because of the larger rainfall are smaller. So this completely eliminates any differences in the quality of plots. This is purely a scale effect on the type of labor that's hired and the consequence because of transaction costs, fixed transaction costs for the cost of labor. Okay. So what about equipment? Well, what we see in the data is that, I'll show you this. When we look at sprayers, as farm sizes increase from the smallest scales, they're more likely to use the equipment per hour. It's increasing, but at the larger scales, equipment hourly per acre goes down. The same for tractors. Okay. Now we're going to concentrate on sprayers, and the reason is that the data set don't tell us anything about the size of these tractors or the capacity of the tractors, so we can't implement anything structurally with tractors. Tractors are a tiny fraction of operation costs. While everyone uses a tractor, it's about 2% or so of the total cost. What we're going to focus on is sprayers. Now, sprayers make up about 14% of total operation costs. But the reason we're looking at them is that for sprayers, we can tease out the capacity of the sprayers that are used. The measure of sprayer capacity is the amount of material that is sprayed per unit of time by a sprayer. There's a square root relationship between the amount of spray per unit of time of a sprayer and the radius of the area that's sprayed. So a sprayer that has this higher capacity of more output per unit of time is a sprayer that is relevant to a larger scale of operation. And the reason that we can measure Q for sprayers is that the data set provides us with the amount of material the farmer has purchased, the amount of hours that the sprayer that he's using is used. So we can divide hours into the material that's sprayed, and that's a measure of capacity. So we know the capacity of the sprayers that the farmers are using, which is why we can plot that, right? So this is just saying that, right? And what we see is that measure of capacity, which is output per unit of time for the sprayer is used, its relationship with the size of, in this case, farm size, but you find the same thing with plot size, that larger farms are using higher capacity sprayers, just as we saw was implied by the model, and it's sort of obvious, okay? The nice thing about sprayers as well is that it's clear what the substitute labor cost is, and that's weeding. If you spray, you'll have less weeds, and therefore you'll need to hire less labor for weeding. And that's exactly what you see. At the larger scales, weeding labor costs per acre go down, but total sprayer costs per acre don't change very much because they're shifting to higher capacity machines, which have lower price per unit of capacity. And remember, the larger farms are using a higher capacity sprayer. Okay, so they're saving on labor costs, which is another reason that their profitability per acre is going up. All right. So what about the pricing? All right, this is just saying that larger farms are more likely to own things. All right, so we went to the web. We wanted to buy a sprayer. We needed to get the price schedule, and this is what we saw. Okay, so these are a set of power sprayers. The price schedule, in fact, provided the same sprayer capacity metric that we use in our data, which is the amount of material in liters sprayed per hour. And you can see from the smallest power sprayer to the largest, there's a 13-fold increase in capacity. When we look at the price, it's only a 3.5 times increase in price. Okay? So new is clearly less than 1 here, right? There's nonlinear pricing. So a farm that can take advantage of the large capacity machine is going to pay less per hour, assuming the rental price is going to reflect the price of the machine, which is the usual thing. And that's exactly what we see. We see that the larger farmers who are using larger capacity machines are paying a higher rental price, right? That is what we would expect given the machines are higher capacity. Okay. So we in fact see that these are just regressions that show that what we see in the graphs are just statistically significant. Okay. So we're now going to estimate sprayer scale economies. We're going to estimate the capacity function, that 5 function, and we're going to estimate new using the ICRISAT data on the relationship between the rental prices that we see in the ICRISAT data and the capacity of the machines that we see the farmers that are using. So we can obtain the price schedule and therefore new, and we can obtain the optimal effective capacity by farm scale. Okay. Now, it's obvious that the capacity of the machine the farm is using is endogenous, and the capacity that's chosen affects the price, and also the price affects capacity, right? The capacity is basically endogenous. Okay, so we're going to take that into account in our estimation. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to eliminate, and the price is going to be endogenous just in general, because if there's a higher demand for higher capacity machines, that's going to up the base price P, and it's going to increase the demand for labor, which is going to increase the wage rate, right? So those are endogenous. So we have to deal with these endogeneity problems. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to randomize within a village. We'll assume the village is the labor market, okay, the set of farmers, and we're going to look at the difference in the optimal scales, optimal capacity of 2 different farmers who have 2 different scales, okay? So we have this moment condition that the expected value of the difference between the first order conditions of these 2 randomly chosen farmers should be equal to 0. Now notice that because we're differencing across farmers in the same village, we've eliminated that additive term, which you may recall had the wage rate and the base price in it. Okay, so that by differencing across farmers in the same village, we eliminate the endogeneity associated with the base price and the wages. And we have the same moment for the differences in the prices that are used. We're going to parameterize the phi function. The effective capacity function is quadratic. Okay, and we're going to estimate jointly these moment conditions using the generalized method of moments. We're going to use land area and land area squared as instruments because they're exogenous in this model, and that's going to enable us to estimate new and the parameters of the effective capacity function. Okay? So these are the estimates. Okay. So first, our estimate is new is 0.3, which is well below 1, given that's measured with high precision. We can reject the hypothesis that it's equal to 1. Okay. We get a quadratic in the effective capacity function. We can compute from the quadratic where increasing scale stops increasing effective capacity, and that's at 24.5 acres. So it says that the optimal farm size, if we just take into account sprayer capacity, is 24.5 acres. Why 24.5 acres? Why isn't it 50 acres or 12 acres? Okay. Well, basically, it's the largest farm size in the data, or plot size in the data. Okay. And the reason it's the largest plot size in the data is that there are no machines with capacity suitable for plots larger than 25 acres. There's no demand for it. Nobody's selling a machine that nobody would want. Okay. So we're in this equilibrium trap that you're not going to see large machines for large farms in India because there are no large farms and therefore there's no demand. Okay. So we basically hit the ceiling, right? We get that the optimal farm size is in fact the largest farms in India. Okay, given the capacity of the machines that exist in India. Okay, so this is just says what I said, and notice we're not taking into account that farms could use drones, for example. So this drone can basically power spray an acre of land in 10 minutes. Okay, well, you're not going to hire this expensive drone if basically you only have 1 acre. You're not going to hire a drone for 10 minutes. Okay, this is a sprayer that only the largest farms can ever use, and that is far more effective than any power sprayer that is driven or used by a worker. Okay, it also sprays much more evenly than the power sprayer that is done by a person. All right, so I'm running out of time. Okay, so we're going to take our estimates and we're going to calibrate the full model. We're going to use data from all of India, not just ICRSAT data. Okay, and this calibration is going to enable us to then see if we can match the U shape that we observe in the data. It's going to enable us to observe what the marginal product of labor is on the autarkic farms, because it's not the wage rate, because there's no workers working off the farm and there's no laborers that are hired. Okay, so we can do all those things, but because I'm running out of time, okay, I won't go through the details of the calibration. I'll just give you the results. Okay, and I'll show you the model fit. The model fits. This is profits per acre. That's the red is the data, and the model is the blue. It fits output per acre. We're fitting the model on those two moments. We're not fitting the model on labor hours per acre, but it fits that just as well. Okay, so the model does pretty well. The model is capable of spitting out the transaction cost, the fixed transaction cost that we see in the wage schedules, even though we don't use those data to calibrate the model. Okay, so skipping over that, let's do the counterfactual. We get that the optimal farm size is about 25 acres. We make all the farms 25 acres. We take into account that the wage rate is a fixed point, because as we increase the farm scale, that's going to affect the demand for labor, which is going to affect the equilibrium wage, which is going to change the effective capacity of the machinery that's used, et cetera. Okay, but the counterfactual we get with an elasticity of labor demand in the urban area, which results in a slight decrease in the wage, is the following. If we make all farms optimal, okay, we go from 3.1 acres to 24 acres, reduction in farms of 87%, size of the labor force goes down by only 16%, total output rises by 42%, output per acre rises by 68%. There's 83 million surplus farms. Why do we get this output? Okay, but first let me show you that this wild idea of a reduction of 87% of the farms is not very different from what the Zamindari Commission calculated. They calculated that if the 10-acre holding was what farms would be in India, there would be a 66% decrease in the number of farms. So they did the same kind of calibration that we're doing with just not taking into account all the technology as well. The sources of the gains. Mode machine capacity rises by 72%. Almost all machines now use machines. There's reduction in the workforce because of the substitutability between labor and machines. Okay, there are economies associated with the fact that now you don't have any autarkic farms. which underutilize labor. Okay, in fact, the calibration shows that on a typical autarkic farm, they only use 2.7 hours per acre per day, as opposed to the efficient 1 acre farm, which uses almost 10 hours of acre per day. And of course, for the largest farm, the optimal farm, they're only using half of the hours per day, per acre per day of the 1 acre farm, because they can save using the machinery. So labor utilization is substantially less, but the reduction in the labor force is not as great as you would have thought, because labor right now in India is actually underutilized because of the transaction costs of labor. So India is substantially less productive as a consequence of the toleration of low farm sizes in India. We see why that's true, what larger scale farming permits farmers to do, save on the transaction costs and labor costs, and to exploit the economies of scale in the capacity of machines. The optimal farm scale that we get is only on existing capacity. It does not mean that farms in India shouldn't be 400 acres like they are in the US. It just means that we can only say they should be at least 25 acres. Okay. There's always going to be the issue of how you accomplish the consolidation. And let me end by showing you that there was a consolidation. Okay, so 2 points. The first is that because of the U shape, it's almost impossible for a given farmer with 3 acres of land to jump to a farm size of 25 acres. He would have to negotiate with 8 different farmers who are adjacent to him. There would be a holdup problem. It's also true that just incrementing a farm size from 3 acres to 6 acres actually results in a reduction of profitability per acre. And therefore, he's not going to be able to pay for those 3 acres, because they're worth more to the farm who has the 3 acres than it is to him. He has to basically jump over that chasm, going from 3 acres to 25 acres. And that would be impossible, we think. So that's an equilibrium trap as well. It means that what we see historically, it helps us understand what we observe historically, which is there's been no bootstrapped land consolidation. It's all been done by fiat, by government. And the last major one was in France. And let me show you what that. So this was France at the end of World War II. This is what farms looked like. They were small. Okay. And the French government underwent a mandatory land consolidation, which forced farmers to sell at a fair price that the government paid, or attempt to be a fair price. So this is a not satellite view, 1947, but an airplane view of what farms look like. And after the reform, the same area looked like that. And there's a tractor in the middle. Okay. And there was a substantial 4-fold increase in total output from France at the time. So land consolidation can make a major impact on output and incomes per capita. Let me stop there because I'm over time.
Thank you very much, Mark, for a fascinating presentation. In fact, a lot of unknown factors, at least I did learn there. So since we are beyond our scheduled time, it's up to you. Should we take one question?
Well, we're going to have a breakout session, later this evening. So why don't we postpone to that so people can move on to the next event?
Sure. So in that case, we are going to draw the curtain for this presentation. And those who have questions, in fact, there are a few questions, please take up those questions again in the breakout session. Thank you very much, Mark, for your long drawn and elaborate presentation on the Indian agricultural system. So we'll meet you again in the breakout session.
All right, very good. Thank you for listening.
Just a small announcement. So the next session is at 8:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time and 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The final talk by Mark. And the breakout session today is 10:30 p.m. instead of 10:15 p.m., which was earlier in the earlier days. So which is 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's it. Thank you.
Hi, so Shomendu or whoever. Yeah, Shomendu. So should we start? Oh, the speaker is not here. Okay.
No, once the speaker is here, you can start.
Okay.
Maybe you can tilt your camera a little bit.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have the thing. What would you like to see here? Is that okay?
This is better.
Okay, this is fine. All right.
So how did the other conference go? The INSEE one? You are muted.
Yeah, no, that went well, but unfortunately, I missed very good stuff.
I see.
At our own winter school.
Oh yeah.
This time around, yeah. The winter school dinner being not the least of them.
Oh yeah. So there's a plan to do something about it.
Yeah.
Is small joining?
I don't know. So you see, Sugata ended the last talk saying that we'll meet now in the breakout session. So
I then made the announcement.
Yeah. But well.
Mark has quite elaborate papers with
Yes.
lots of results.
Yeah.
So I think he has spent a lot of time working in India, right?
Working on India? Yeah, I suppose so.
And in India.
I wouldn't know. He's co-author at some time. Andy Foster used to visit very regularly.
I see.
But I don't know about Rosenzweig.
Yeah, he's here.
Oh. Hi, Professor Rosenzweig.
Yes.
Hi, welcome back. So my name is Abhijit Banerji, or I should say also Abhijit Banerji. Yeah, actually, we've never met, but we were lucky to have you as editor of the Journal of Development Economics, in which you were very kind to a paper of ours. And this was some 15 years ago.
Okay, very good.
So shall we start, Shomendu? It's
yeah, please.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm hello everyone. I'm the gatekeeper or the chair for this final session with Professor Rosenzweig, and we've had two fabulous talks already, and those were in some sense very sort of trademark Mark Rosenzweig. They had theory as well as lots of very serious data work. And I'm just wondering, because this looks totally different. So now the third and final lecture will be on, as it says, does democratization increase economic development and actually give more influence to the poor? So the floor is yours, Mark.
All right. Thank you very much. All right, so as all of you probably know, there's been a lot of attention to the issue, which may be a salient question for people in India in particular, of whether democracy is good for economic development or not. And there's been a lot of empirical work, mostly by macroeconomists, which look at cross-country data, maybe cross-country data over time, to look empirically at what the relationship is between governments that are democratic and governments who are not democratic. Now, it's pretty clear that, so most of this literature doesn't talk about the mechanisms by which democracy might affect economic growth. And it's pretty clear that one of the ways in which the form of governance is going to affect economic growth is via its influence on the composition of public goods that the government controls. And by public goods, I mean goods that are paid for and determined by the government. Of course, it's paid for by the population, but so what we aim to do in this paper is to look at how the shift to democracy from autocracy, and we'll define what we mean by that, affects the composition of public goods and thus the overall output. So when we think about the composition of public goods, so for example, governments pay for transfer programs, and governments also pay for infrastructure like roads or irrigation facilities. And it's pretty clear that irrigation facilities and roads are investments that have effects on economic growth and output in the future, while transfer programs might have some effect on economic growth, but it'll be very indirect. And so the composition of public goods is really going to matter. And the form of governance might very well affect what types of public goods are invested in. So you might have heard in the United States, there was a big debate about how much to spend on infrastructure and how much to spend on social programs. That debate is continuing, okay? And that composition is going to very much affect economic growth in the future, as well as a lot of other things. The well-being of a population, economic growth is not the only thing that one could compare about, okay? Now, we're going to model autocratic and democratic decision-making, but we're going to do that in the context of an equilibrium model, which is going to embed in it groups that have very different interests in particular public goods. So we'll have groups that want, say, irrigation, and groups that would prefer to have employment programs, for example. And we're going to compare the theoretical composition of public goods for each regime, that is the democratic regime and the aristocratic regime, to the composition that maximizes income. That is, there's no reason to believe that either regime, that either democracy or autocracy, which we'll define as a particular interest group that controls the public resource allocations, will be ideal if one is just trying to maximize income. And so we'll look at that as well. And from the model, we're going to be able to derive implications for how shifting to democracy from autocracy or aristocracy, okay, actually influences the composition of public goods, but in a way that will inform us whether this nominal democratization is truly democracy or whether it's been captured by an elite. And then in fact, it's a democracy in name only, and it's really just an aristocracy in which one group is dominating the decisions about public goods. Now, it was mentioned that, you know, a lot of my work has data and has models. Well, this is just like that. We're going to apply the model to data that Andrew Foster and I collected on 253 villages over the period 1971 to 99. Not all this was designed by us. This is research data that was carried out, survey work that was carried out by the National Council of Economic Research. I'll describe the data in more detail in a few minutes. But the data are going to give us a time series of the form of governance in these villages in India, as well as the public programs that were initiated, and also direct information on infrastructure that we see in those villages. And this period, 71 to 99, corresponds to the period when India experienced village democratization that was promoted by state level and national constitutional amendments. So many villages actually experienced a change to a democratically elected council, panchayats, moving from mostly a rule by a headman, who is usually a large landowner in the village. And we're going to supplement the village level time series data, this panel data on villages, with household and farm level data that's going to enable us to test some of the key assumptions of the model, which are going to enable us to get some clear comparative statics from the model. So the key points of the model are that public goods are heterogeneous in their effects on productivity and growth, as I've already said. But most importantly, we need to look at the population in terms of groups that have common interests among them, in the sense that they benefit differentially from different public goods, but there are many groups and they have different preferences over the composition of public goods because they benefit differentially from them. In autocracy, one of the groups dominates. So one group determines the allocation of public goods to the exclusion of the other groups, okay? And so they're going to exercise their own preferences for those public goods. But under democracy, all interest groups have a say in the allocation of public goods, where the important weights are population shares. I mean, it's a sort of the definition of what democracy does if it really exists, okay? So democracy or democratization is going to shift the public goods composition because more weight is going to be given compared to the aristocratic regime to these other interest groups. But that shift may or may not increase productivity. It's going to depend on what that shift is in terms of the composition of public goods. Okay. So challenges for predicting what will happen due to democratization are, first of all, we have to identify the interest groups and specify which public goods they will prefer. We also have to specify how each of the public goods affects the welfare of the groups, which is essentially similar to one, because that's going to determine which of the goods they like. And we're going to have to determine how these goods affect productivity. And then third, we're going to have to take into account that whatever these groups are, they interact in the equilibrium of the economy. Okay, they just don't only play a role in determining the public goods composition, but they also play a role in the economy at large. Okay. Now, in the context of the Indian rural economy, these are rural villages in which agriculture is the dominant industry or occupation. We're going to specify two key exogenous interest groups: those who own land and those who do not. Okay. We're going to also focus on three infrastructural public goods or programs, which we're going to show empirically have different effects on the outcomes and welfare of these two interest groups. We're going to look at public schools, irrigation, and electrification, all of which correspond to locally determined public goods. And then we're also going to look at employment programs that produce goods that are preferred equally by both interest groups, but are going to benefit directly the landless more than the landed, as we'll show. Okay. And what we're going to show is that, for example, secondary schooling augments agricultural productivity, but not the wages of the landless, and that secondary schools are favored by the landed and not the landless. Irrigation augments agricultural productivity. That's pretty obvious. But what's less well known is that it doesn't actually increase the demand for labor. And so it's clear that public irrigation programs are going to be favored by the landed, and because they don't benefit the labor, they're not going to be favored by the landless whose income is dominated by wage earnings. I'm going to show you that in electrified villages, the landed households benefit more, and that employment programs increase wages based on some recent RCT by Emily Breza and Supreet Kaur. All right, so we show and in the model and find that the effects of on the composition of public goods and this overall income is going to depend on the population shares of these two groups. And in particular, this is our main finding. That is, when the landless are in the majority and we move from government that's dominated by the landed to a true democratic regime where the landless have a say in outcomes, and they are in the majority, there are going to be less secondary schools, less school enrollment, this is what we find, less public irrigation assets, less electrification, and more employment programs. And moreover, when we look at the ratio of landless food consumption per capita compared to the relative to that of the landed, we find that they benefit as well compared to a regime in which the landed rule. Now, these are findings that are in accord with what we see in the data and with what the model suggests. We don't have any predictions for roads or primary schools. And so I'm just going to show you the results that we find for those. And that we find that for those cases, when the landless are in the majority, we get more roads, more improved roads, and more primary school. So it's ambiguous as to what the total effects are of having a larger share of the landless in a village. There's some more infrastructure variables and some less infrastructure variables. Okay. And in one set of findings, which assume there's no heterogeneity in the effects of democratization, which corresponds to all of the estimates in the existing literature, macro literature, we find actually no effect on public good outcomes, that it really does depend on the shares of the landless in the population. So what's the answer to, is democracy good for growth? The answer is it depends. Good economics answer. And we're going to show what it depends on in the Indian context. All right, so let me briefly talk about the prior literature, because some of it is going to inform what we do, and some of it's going to show why we think we have an advance over that literature. So in terms of the macro literature, the latest set of estimates is from Acemoglu and Johnson, appeared in the Journal of Political Economy in 2019. They have a panel of countries covering 50 years. Their outcome variable is log of per capita GDP. They have an instrumental variable strategy for identifying the effects of democracy, which is basically using regional waves of democratization. There's no hypotheses about the mechanisms, and their empirical finding is that democracy increases GDP per capita, it increases investment GDP ratio, it increases schooling, and there's no change in TFP. So that's it. It's an empirical finding. Okay, but we don't understand why it's positive. And there are no predictions about any of this. Okay. Now, there's a whole set of literature that uses the information on panchayats in India to look at the issue of whether there's elite capture in those panchayats. So an important work is by Bardhan and Mukherjee that appeared in the AR 2011. They have a panel of villages in West Bengal. They look at only one public good, which is land reform, which is something about land. Okay, they have a probabilistic voting model of democracy, which is what we're going to use as well, with land holdings determining interest groups. So that's going to more or less correspond to what we're doing. And the key finding that we're going to incorporate as well is that party ideology, they find is unimportant empirically, that you get what you would expect, which is that land reform is less likely when the land holding population share is larger, right? And because the interest group of the landed is not to have their land broken up. There's an article by Besley and a number of co-authors. They have a cross section of panchayats. The ones that they focus on are panchayats that represent multiple villages in 5 Indian states. And what they find, they don't have a model of democracy. They have basically a bargaining model between the elected head of the council and the rest of the council. And they basically find elite capture of it in a particular way. What they show is that whoever is the pradhan, whoever's the head of the council, can explain where the total expenditures of public goods are allocated to across the villages. In particular, more public goods are allocated to the pradhan's village. So there's an effect on the spatial allocation. Now, there's no model of the demand for the return to public goods. So it's actually not possible to say whether this is a good or bad thing. It could be that the pradhan's village is the village that has the highest return to public goods. But in fact, moreover, when we look at the individual public goods allocated to the pradhan's villages, some are in fact higher and some are lower. And there's no explanation for that. So in fact, there's a different composition. We don't know this is good or bad or what to make of this finding, except that pradhan matters. There's a recent paper by Brown and other co-authors. They have, again, a cross-section of villages. They're actually using the data that was designed by Andrea Foster and myself, which has street-level detail. They have a probabilistic voting model like Bardan and Mukherjee. They assume the elite are landowners. And what they do is they make use of the fact that there's this randomization that's imposed on the elections, whereby you'll find that sometimes the Pradhan cannot run again if he's a man, and in the next election, the Pradhan has to be a woman. So that means he's term limited, okay? And sometimes the Pradhan can run for re-election because of the randomization. And what they find is that when the Pradhan is term limited, he can't run again, okay? More resources go to streets with more landed households, okay? So that they call elite capture. When he's not term limited and they're therefore going to run again, they find that more resources go to streets with higher voting shares, which is what you would expect under democracy. What they don't show, however, is which one of those is better, is more appropriate. I mean, it could be that when the Pradhan is term limited, he can do what he thinks is best for the villages. And when he's not term limited, he has to kowtow to different interest groups, which may or may not be good for growth. And in fact, they find the same thing. While it's true that the more landed get more resources total, they also find that some of the resources are less among the landed and some are more. And they only have ad hoc explanations. In other words, there's no attention in any of these studies to the composition of public goods. They're only looking at the spatial allocation of the goods. Okay. The closest study to looking at the effects of democratization is one by Burgess and co-authors that was published in the AR in 2015. They also have a setting in which there are different interest groups, namely different ethnic groups in Kenya, who tend to be concentrated in different provinces. And what they find is Kenya is a country that actually shifted from autocracy to democracy and also back again. They get back and forth. They have a model of autocratic behavior subject to constraints on power. So there's no model of democracy at all. And what the model says is the autocrat's going to favor his ethnic group. That's the elite capture. The measure of the public good is just roads. And what they find is that when there is autocracy, the leader of the country allocates more of the roads to his co-ethnic areas. But when there's democracy, we don't see that. Okay. Now, a good feature of this study is they actually compute what the optimal allocation of roads is, and they show that in fact, when there's autocracy, it's not optimal. But of course, it's only looking at one public good. So again, we don't have any information on the composition of public goods. And secondly, it's not clear why there's the shift to democracy. Why should we believe that the shift to democracy is sort of random and unrelated to other things? And in fact, some of the information in the paper is about showing that there was more press freedom, influence of non-governmental organizations that had entitlement agendas, which may have pushed the country in particular directions. Right. So that's where we are. So in this project, we're going to model a village economy with the two interest groups. We're going to have the two types of public goods, employment enhancing and productivity enhancing. Set up that model, show what happens under democracy, and yield a proposition that we can test. We'll describe the data. We'll look at evidence on how the interest groups benefit from the particular types of public goods. And then we'll estimate the heterogeneous effects of democratization. All right, so we'll start with the theory. Okay. So let me tell you what the end result of the theory is, that this is the proposition we're going to get from the theory, which is that under the conditions in which landed households are net hirers of labor, the landless are net beneficiaries of wage increases, and increases in agricultural assets do not increase the demand for labor, all of which we're going to test with data. Then we can show that when there's a shift to democracy and the landless are in the majority, as opposed to not in the majority, there's going to be a reduction compared to the autocratic regime in investment in agricultural assets and in schooling and in electrification, and a relative increase in employment. So now we'll look at what the theory is and what the issues are. So as I said, there's the two classes of interest groups who are otherwise identical. They're just differentiated by whether they own land or not, which we're going to assume to be exogenous. So there's a row fraction of households that are landless. There's a fixed amount A of land for the village. So the farm size of each landed household is going to be A, which is the farm size, divided by 1 minus rho, the fraction of households that are landed. We designate the landless by N and the landed by A. The landless work on the land owned by the landed, and they work for a wage, W. So labor is geographically immobile, so we're going to treat the village as the labor market. Output is a tradable good, so we're not going to worry about the endogenous price of the agricultural output. All right, so we'll assume that the village or community is provided a fixed amount of public funds from a central government that can be allocated to 3 public goods or programs: an employment program that employs R workers per household, and employs them at whatever the local equilibrium wage is, that produces a good or service that's equally valued by the landless and landed. So whatever the employment program is for, both the land and landless like the output, and the returns to that output are not different across the two groups. There's a faculty that's constructed using external inputs, not local labor, that are also benefit both groups equally. And then there's a construction of an asset Q infrastructure that directly augments the productivity of agricultural production. We can think of that as irrigation, electrification, and perhaps schooling, if schooling augments productivity in farming. So the per household public budget constraint P then consists of the expenditures on the employment program. There are workers employed at the equilibrium wage W. There's the Q, which is the infrastructure, which is going to depend on what type of infrastructure. The details are not that important. Okay, and then the other good that's produced by external inputs. All right, so the agricultural, we have to model the economy. The agricultural production function is constant returns to scale, which has 2 inputs, labor and the agricultural asset per acre. We describe that as in per acre terms. So of course, land is important as the input. The labor market clears. We have equilibrium profit and wage functions, which we set out. We posit linear utility functions. We do linear utility functions both to simplify the model, but also to sort of eliminate that welfare is going to be increased by transfer functions. So if all of the utility functions are linear and they're identical for landed and landed households, there's no return in terms of total welfare from just redistributing the public funds with direct transfers across the households. So the utility functions are the same. They get utility from consumption, from whatever the good is that's produced from the employment program that employs the R workers, and they get utility from this other good H. What differentiates the two groups is the budget constraints. So the income for the landed depends on the profits of their farms, as well as the wages if any of the members work in the market, and the consumption of the income of the landless workers depends solely on their wage rate that they earn. All right, so we'll start with governance, and we'll begin with aristocratic governance or autocratic governance, where basically the allocation of public goods is totally in the hands of one group, the landed. And they allocate the public goods to maximize their own utility. So we simply substitute in the public budget constraint into the utility function of the landed, and we determine the first order necessary conditions, for example, for the amount of the public resources allocated for the infrastructure investment. And you can see that the first order condition tells us that what's going to matter is the extent to which the investment in infrastructure affects equilibrium wages. We can think of that as trickle down. So you invest in irrigation, is that going to increase wages for the landless workers? It's surely going to increase the profitability of farms. That's shown up in the second expression, the effective Q on on output, okay? And it's going to have an effect to the budget constraint because you're allocating more Q on the other goods that are produced, okay? So what matters is the effect of Q on W and the effect of Q on output. And Q could be schooling, it could be on, or electrification. So if it's schooling, for example, then it depends on whether schooling augments wages, and it depends on whether schooling augments profitability. We compare the aristocratic allocation of public goods to the allocation that simply maximizes GDP per household. And what we show is that there's excess spending on the infrastructure programs relative to the allocation that maximizes GDP. And the conditions are simply that the landed are net hirers of labor, and there's very small trickle down, that the agricultural assets don't strongly increase the wages of labor. So the next then we model democratic governance and public goods composition. Here we're going to use a reasonably straightforward probabilistic voting model. The decision makers are elected from a competition between candidates who appeal to the interests of all members of the community, namely they appeal to the interests of both the landed and the landed. If the interest groups differ across the two classes, then the relative sizes of the two groups are going to play a direct role in the determination of the public good composition, because to get elected, you're going to have to give more weight to the group that's larger. So we assume there are two parties that compete for public office, and the households vote based on the value they assign to the parties. We can specify the value assigned to a particular party X as a function of the promises, their platform, which is how much is going to be spent on Q, R, and H, okay, plus a random term. This is the stochastic voting model, okay, where people are going to vote based not only on the returns they get from the particular composition of public goods, but on other factors that are orthogonal to that, which may be related to the fact that they were the same jati, or they have charisma, or some other factors as well. And that's there because otherwise, if any group had a simple majority, then that would completely dominate what goes on. Yeah. All right. So when the epsilon, this random term, has an extreme value distribution that's independent across households, then we can determine the expected proportion of votes that are going to be received by any party, given whatever platform is promised by the party. This is an equilibrium game because each party is going to choose the public goods allocation to promise to maximize its chance of winning given the policy choice of the other party. And we can show there's a unique Nash equilibrium of this game in which essentially the result is that both parties are going to offer the same policy. And that policy is going to depend on the voter shares of the two groups. And in particular, the first order condition, for example, for the Q infrastructure good is just going to be the weighted, it's going to equalize the weighted marginal utilities of the two groups, where the weights are their fraction in the population. So how does the allocation of Q and R under democracy compare to that which maximizes per household GDP? With respect to R, it's very clear that under democracy, there's going to be excessive spending on employment programs. And with respect to Q, it's going to depend on whether or not Q increases or decreases the wage, whether an increase in the infrastructure increases the demand for labor or reduces the demand for labor. So it's unlikely that either in the autocratic regime or in the democratic regime, you're going to get a composition of public goods that maximizes GDP. Now we're going to compare the two forms of governance, okay? And we'll define democratization, obviously, as a move from a regime in which one interest group controls public resources to one in which all households have a say in how public funds are allocated, depending on their proportions, given our models. And if we get some predictions from the shift, okay, that's a true shift in democracy, that's going to enable us then to say whether there in fact has been a democratization, because if there hasn't been, there should be no change in the allocation of public goods relative to the aristocratic regime. Yeah. So to do that, we consider an objective function, which embeds in it the two forms of government. For D equals 0, that is, there's no democracy, the maximand is going to reflect solely the welfare of the landed households. And when there's democracy, as we've seen, it's going to depend on the weights of the population shares and the interest of the two groups. All right, so again, democracy is going to give weight to the interest of the landless in proportion to their share in the population. And under the aristocratic rule, the interests of the landless are not considered at all. So in principle, it seems like it doesn't matter what fraction of the population is landless. However, that's not true, because the fraction of the population landless affects the returns to the investments, the public investments for the landed. Okay. So rho, the fraction of landless, enters the first order conditions determining the allocation of public goods in the aristocratic regime, not because of voting shares, but because it affects their returns to the public goods compositions. Okay. Now, why is that? Because in the model, an increase in the share landless in a village with a fixed amount of land must mean that the amount of land per landed household increases. And when the amount of land per landed household is higher, the returns to infrastructure investments like irrigation and perhaps schooling rise. So there's a direct relationship between rho and the allocation of public goods, even in the aristocratic regime, which has nothing to do with voting shares. Okay. Now, it turns out then in this model, okay, when we set out the first order conditions, embedding the governance model into the general equilibrium of the economy, we get the following first order conditions. Okay, so these take into account the effect of rho on the composition of the size of the landed land holdings. Okay, so we see that D appears in both of the first order conditions. So that tells us that it's going to matter, the public allocations, depending on whether it's a democracy or not. Okay, but you can also see, I think, quickly, that when D is equal to 1, that is under democracy, rho disappears from the first order conditions. That is, under democracy, there is no effect of rho in this model. So even though it seemed like in the democratic model, the voter shares of the landless matters, when we take into account the general equilibrium effects of the rho, it's wiped out. And that's simply because an increase in rho, which increases their influence in democracy, is accompanied by an increase in the average size of the landed households, which increases their demand for particular public goods, and they completely offset each other. So we can't test whether it's a true democracy by just looking at regimes in which we have democracy. That is, we can't take a cross-section of villages which are all under democracy and tease out any implications about how the share of the landless in those villages is going to affect the public goods composition, because it shouldn't. What we need to do is compare what happens to the public goods allocations when we shift from a regime of domination by the landed to a democratic regime, and how the shift in the composition of public goods depends on the size of rho. Okay, so this says that. So this is what we do. We look at the change, for example, in Q as a function of rho under democracy relative to the change in the effect of rho on Q under aristocracy. We get expressions for both R and Q. Okay, and from those expressions, under certain conditions, we get the proposition that I stated at the outset of discussing the model. Okay, that the shift to democracy from aristocracy is going to depend on rho in particular ways, which we're going to look at. Okay, all right, so that's the model. By the way, if there are any questions, please relay them to me from the chair at any time if you want to ask some clarifying questions or any challenging questions as well. All right, so what are our data? So the key feature of the data that we need is that we need a change from to democracy. Okay, and that's exactly what has gone on in India in the last two decades of the 20th century, based on amendments at the state and national level. Okay, so in one of the rounds of the Rural Economic Development Survey, we incorporated a set of questions on village governance. In particular, in the 1999-2000 resurvey of rural households. And that's going to give us this information. This is going to basically quantify and characterize the move to democracy at the village level. It's going to, in fact, in concert with the 1981-82 round, enable us to compute a time series from 1971 to 1999, basically the last 30 years of the 20th century. Okay. Let me talk a little bit about the Rural Economic Development Survey. So when it started in the late 1960s, it was a survey of rural households that's meant to be representative when you use the sampling weights of the rural population in 16 of the major states of India. The random sample, the stratified random sample, had composed of 5,000 households. And they started with 261 villages. We're going to use data from 1971, from 1982, and 1999, those three rounds of the data, to construct time series of governance at the village level, public programs, and infrastructure. What we incorporated in the 1999 round was a village level questionnaire, which asked informed observers in those villages to tell us the forms of government that changed in those villages, the sort of dated changes of those villages. So there were 6 governance classifications: traditional, panchayat, you can see them there. Okay, and the knowledgeable village informants told us the dates at which there was a shift from one of those classifications to another. Okay? And we're going to consider a village as democratic in a given year if it falls in the category of elected panchayat. Okay. The traditional panchayat is a panchayat that may have a council, but the members are not elected. It's not necessarily a democratic council. So this is what we see. If we look at the villages that had transitioned to an elected panchayat, this gives us the fraction for those transitional villages that of the initial governance form that they transitioned from. And what you can see is that most of the transitions were from a form of governance where it was a village headman that made decisions. It was basically an autocratic regime. And in almost all of those cases, the headman is a large landholder. Okay. So given those dates, we can construct an annual time series over those 30 years for 250 sample villages. Now, just as I criticized the Kenya study for the possibility that the shifts in village governance are not exogenous, okay, we are going to worry about that as well. Okay? And what we're going to use as our identification strategy is the state level timing of the amendments that were aimed at pushing the states and the villages to democratize. Okay, and while we're not going to maintain that the timing of the amendments is random, what we are going to say is that the effects at the village level are going to depend on the share of the landless in the villages, and that's going to be essentially the interaction between the amendments and the share of the initial share of the population of the villages that are landless are going to be our main instrument for determining whether, in fact, the village shifted to democracy, with, of course, village fixed effects. What were those state amendments? Well, we classified them into 3 stages. There were initial efforts. All of these stages seem to have been initiated by some committee that was set up. The first efforts were in the states of Rajasthan, Andhra Pradesh, and then starting with another committee in 1977, there was legislation in 4 other states. And then there was a third stage where there was a national constitutional amendment that basically pushed all of the states to democratize at the village level. And all states did that, enacted legislation that pushed that, except for Bihar. Okay. What our data shows is that 76% of the survey villages at the end of the time series in 1999 were democratized. And that was up from 62% in 1971. So it's still true up to 1999 that not all the villages had been democratized. But our identification is solely going to come from the within village estimates of a village that gets democratized and comparing the shift in the public goods composition for those villages as the function of the share of the landless in the villages. The two-party model assumption in the data seems to be reasonable. And the 1999 data tells us that for 75% of the elected panchayats, at least 60% of the members were from one or two parties. So that seems to dominate. This depicts the graph of the amendment. So it's the fraction of villages that were subject to the state amendments, stage 2 and stage 3, are the discontinuous lines. And the continuous line is the fraction of villages that were democratic by year. Okay, that looks like a small slope, but that's because of the range of the y-axis. All right, what about public program initiations? The 1999 and the 1982 rounds provide retrospective histories on initiation dates of the public programs. The time series overlap, that is in the 1982 reds, the time series go back prior to 1971, prior to 1982, sorry. And that means that we can actually compare the statements about what occurred in terms of initiation dates prior to 82 from the 82 round with the reports from the 1999 round about events that occurred before 1982, and they match up pretty well. So it doesn't look like there's going to be a lot of measurement error. Now, these are all going to be dependent variables, so we hope that whatever measurement there is relatively random, and it's not going to affect anything but the precision of our estimates. All right, so what are the ones that we can look at where we have the timing of initiation? We have the construction of government schools in the village by date and by level of school, primary, secondary. We have the initiation of 3 types of employment programs: an employment program, quote, for general welfare, a professional training program, and a pre-NREGA guaranteed employment scheme. So all of these things occurred before NREGA. And then third, we have the initiation of a food for work program that was aimed at building irrigation facilities. And then finally, we have a village electrification. We have the date at which the villages became electrified. Okay. So we have both Q and we have R variables. We also have information on roads. When road building was initiated, we have information on the character of the roads in these villages. But the reason I'm de-emphasizing that here is for all of these particular programs, we're going to be able to say which of the two groups are benefiting. Okay. So this is a graph of the fraction of villages that for which there was a government school. You can see they both primary and secondary, both rising over time. This graph shows the fraction of villages that had a guaranteed employment scheme, training scheme, and general employment. Now notice the y-axis goes from 0 to 0.1, right? There's a very small fraction of these villages that had these programs, but they were rising over time. Yeah. And then finally, we have the fraction of villages that had a food for work irrigation program and the fraction of villages that were electrified over the period. So there's general upward trends in infrastructure variables and schools and employment programs mildly as well. Now, a question you might have is whether these programs are locally initiated. So the data that we collected in 99 and similar to the data that had been collected in 82 show that 73% of the locally determined projects involve schools and irrigation. Okay, so the data provide us with which were the local determination, which of the goods were locally determined. The employment programs, however, are clearly externally funded, but the councils or the head of the village can apply for these grants. And so we expect that the existence of these employment programs are going to again reflect the interests of the groups that are in power or have a higher share of the voting population. You'll note that we're ignoring local revenues. Of the total panchayat budgets, only about 12% is raised from local taxes, so we're going to assume that's ignorable. Okay, and as I said, there are lots of other programs as well. If you just look at the minutes from panchayat meetings that we actually collected in the 2005 round of the Reds, you can see that the discussion of electrification, irrigation, and schools and employment schemes constitute a large fraction of the discussions that were going on in these panchayats. All right, the land classes are straightforward. We have sampling weights in the Reds. Yeah, there's a question.
Rosenzweig. So
Yes.
there are a couple of questions from Shoro Porkar.
Okay.
So I'm just going to put them to you. So he says, Reds data might be more detailed, but maybe census also has some interesting variables and maybe has an advantage of covering the entire population. So,
okay, let me answer that first, then before we get to the second, so I don't forget it. Okay, I agree that we actually collected village handbooks, and there is direct information in those on what village infrastructure we have, and in one set of estimates that I'm going to show you, we use some of that census data. The issue of representativeness is just a standard issue, right? We're going to look at relationships. Okay, we're going to look at the effects of democratization. And because we're looking at relationships, it doesn't matter that we have a sample of villages or we have all the villages in India. However, we're going to use the sample weights that are going to make the village populations representative. So in that sense, we're only getting less precision because we only have 250 villages, but they're going to correspond to what presumably you would see for the whole population. I'm ready for the next one.
So, so he says here that there was also possibly democratization at the district level in the form of creation of Zilla Parishads that you could perhaps consider.
We didn't. We know about those, and we thought of perhaps interacting the two things. But since we're looking at village determined infrastructure, we thought that it's not obvious how there's an influence of these government organizations, but we are looking into it. And in particular, maybe the employment programs might be a function of those higher level committees.
Okay.
Good.
All right.
Good questions. All right. And I welcome more questions as we move along as well. All right. So we're defining the land classes. We have the population weights, as I said, in the Reds to make these representative, so we can get for each of the village the appropriate fraction of the population that is landless. The proportions have basically remained the same over the period. And because we don't want democratization to affect the rows, we're going to stick with the initial 1971 fractions of the population landless. Okay. There is, however, significant variation across the villages. As you see there, the standard deviation of the rows is equal to the mean, okay, for the villages. Okay. Now, we consider the landless proportion and its stagnation as sort of exogenous, that there's no movement, or not very much movement, minimal movement between being landless and being landed, right? So these are not groups that people choose to be. A person doesn't wake up without land and decide, tomorrow I'm going to be a farmer with 10 acres of land. That just doesn't happen. Moreover, farmers are not, for the most part, losing their land. And this is not just cheap talk. The panel data is going to show us exactly what happens over time to landless households and landed households. And I'll show you some statistics on that. Okay. So going from the 1982 population to 2000, it's almost 20 years. Okay. We find that if we take landless heads in 1982 and we look at all of the split off households from that landless household 20 years later, only about less than 13% of them owned land. So there were some that acquired land, but it wasn't very much land. And in fact, only less than 9% of them actually own land more than half an acre of land. So there's just very little movement, even over 20 years, between being landless and being landed. Now, if you look at landed households, retrospectively in 2000, who said they didn't own land in 81, but now own land, 92.4% of them received the land via inheritance. So they didn't acquire the land by being landless and buying it. Most of the landless landed households heads now were landless because they were just a member of the family and they didn't actually own the land. So this is simply people inheriting land. What about the other way, exit? So we can look in 2000 at the households that had land, but who said they'd lost land. And when we look at the reason that their farm size decreased, it's because of partition, that they basically were giving land to their sons or gifting land to their children, right? So the role of the market in land sales and purchases is just minimal in India, in rural India. Okay, so we can consider for the most part the lack of mobility from landless to landless means that we can just treat these fractions as features of these villages. Now, what about caste? We're talking about India. Okay, so the earlier studies that looked at this are claiming that interest group definitions and who's elite is not aligned at all with the caste group hierarchy. But we can even look at that in the data. Okay, so this figure shows the fraction of landed by the caste groups and by religion. Okay, so we can see, for example, that in the upper caste, 80% of the households own land, but it's also true in the backward caste. There's no difference. In the Muslim households, about 80% own land. There's only a difference in the scheduled castes and tribes who tend to have a higher fraction landless, but these castes only make about 10% of the population. So for the most part, we can ignore caste in looking at these determinations of public goods composition. It's going to be interest groups, economic interest groups. So this is more Marxist than it is straight economics. All right, we can also look at outcomes. Okay, so what I was just talking about were programs, like food for work programs and employment programs and school building programs and infrastructure and irrigation building programs. Okay, so, but we can also look at some outcomes. We have from the 1982 and 99 REDs, we can look at the inventory of public irrigation assets, tanks, pumps, and wells. And from the survey data from 71, 82, and 99, we can look at the share of land that was irrigated, the changes in school enrollment rates among 10 to 14-year-olds, that by gender. And we can also see who basically is benefiting from the move to democracy by looking at the ratio of the household food expenditures in landless versus landed households. And when we look at roads, which we're going to do at the end, so we don't have any predictions on roads, we're actually going to use the census handbooks. So we have for 1991, we have the villages that have pucca roads, that have improved roads. Okay, so for looking at outcomes, the actual infrastructure, we can see there's been a growth in the share of land irrigated, a growth in school enrollments, and over time, the landed food expenditure, the landless food expenditure share has moved up relative to the landed, that the landless over time are benefiting. So, these are all nice features that, India is improving over time. And this suggests that, in fact, there's been a slight decrease in inequality when we're measuring inequality by the differences in consumption of the landed and landless. Now, the question is, where's this coming from? And what does it have to do with democracy? Okay. So the first thing we have to do is we have to provide evidence for the assumptions of the model that the land classes have actual different interests in the four sets of public goods. That is, they get different returns from investments in those goods.
Could I ask a clarificatory question?
Absolutely, go ahead. Yep.
It's do you also consider the distribution of land across the landed? Because it seems to me from your model that people with very little land
Yes,
may
you're,
benefit more from employment programs.
yes,
than from
exactly, exactly. You're absolutely right. And you missed it because it went by too fast. The proposition is that the landed have to be net hirers of labor, which is exactly your point. Right. So they
Okay,
have to be,
all right.
yeah, exactly. You're precisely right. It's the landed then are hurt by the wage rate increases if they're net hirers of labor. And that's key. So that was one of the assumptions we needed to get these empirical results. So good point, because it's very important that be known. Thank you. All right. So and this is going to come up here when we talk about the interest. So I would have highlighted that in a few minutes. All right. So the first infrastructure variable we'll look at, public goods variable, is irrigation. So we first want to ask, does irrigation increase farm profitability? That's not going to be news, okay, but we want to look at it. But the key one is whether irrigation changes the demand for labor. Okay, so whether there's trickle down from that. And of course, the empirical challenges are that irrigation is correlated with land quality and farmer abilities, access to credit, et cetera. So we need to worry about the reverse causation. That is to say, if a farmer is more capable, that farmer is going to have more profitability, and that's going to enable him to finance irrigation on the farm. Okay, so to do this, we're going to use the latest rounds of the ICRISAT data that I described in earlier lecture, and which is going to provide plot level data for 819 farmers. We have 2,000 plots. Okay. So, and it's going to enable us also to control for soil characteristics. There's a lot of detail on soil characteristics, but it's going to enable us to do something really important, which is, well, two things. The first is we can use as our outcome variable land rent, not land profits, because we would expect that land rent is not going to reflect the characteristics of the farmer himself. That is, if someone is going to pay for the farmer's land, they don't care how good the farmer is. They care about the properties of the land, right? So the rental value shouldn't reflect whether it's a more capable or less capable farmer. But even better than that, because we have a majority of farms in which the farms have multiple plots, we can employ farmer fixed effects. That is, we can examine the relationship between the rental value of a plot and its irrigation share across plots for the same farmer, which means that the fact that the farmer is a good farmer or has better access to credit is going to be irrelevant to that relationship. Okay, so what do we find? Well, let's look. So dependent variable log of land rent with different controls, and then the dependent variable, the log of the wage bill, which is going to tell us whether irrigation affects the demand for labor. Okay, so we have on the right-hand side the log of the share of the plot irrigated and the log of plot size, because we have the log of the rent. Okay, we have village and year fixed effects. We have multiple years. That's going to absorb all the differences in market wages and prices and weather. And then we have, and we're not using farm fixed effects, and we're not controlling for plot characteristics. When we introduce plot characteristics, we get a decline in the effects of the share irrigated of about 13%. Okay, so it matters. There is a correlation between whether a farmer invests in irrigation and the quality of land. They're complements. Okay, and then finally, we use farmer fixed effects. So now we're solely looking at the relationship between irrigation and the value of the land per acre, of course, for the same farmer. And what we see is that a plot that is fully irrigated has 50% more value than, for the same farmer, a plot that has no irrigation. So irrigation has a powerful effect on the value of land, not a surprise. Okay, what about log wage bill? Well, when we go to the preferred farmer fixed effects, we find that there is no effect on the wage bill, that an irrigated plot is not hiring any more labor than a non-irrigated plot. It's not only statistically insignificantly different from zero, it's an economically very small number. Okay, so There is no trickle down from irrigation. It benefits the landed for sure and has no benefits for the landless. So we can chalk that up as a shift to a democratic from aristocratic governance should decrease investments in irrigation when there's a large fraction of the population that is landless, because they don't favor this.
So could I ask a sort of
Sure.
confused question on that? So would that be, would the sort of no effect on wage bill be a result of sort of
Capital labor substitution.
Is it capital labor substitution, or is this surface irrigation which is increasing, and so it's substituting for privately owned groundwater, and so there is sort of not much effect on anything else. It's just one form of water replacing the other.
That's possible, but what we see is that the irrigation is mostly pump irrigation, right, from the ground, as you say, and so you're right. It could be that substitution. I can't say for sure which of those methods, which of those mechanisms is operating.
All right. Okay.
But yes, that it could be either one of those. So now schooling. All right. So in the model, we treat schooling as an agricultural asset that increases farm productivity, but not the wages of workers. Now, a lot of people would say, wait a minute, education is always a good thing. How could it not affect the wages of workers? Let's look. So we're going to use the ICRSAT data and the REDS data to provide evidence on these assumptions, right? But let me say, going into this, the wages that we're looking at are the wages of agricultural workers. The tasks that agricultural workers are carrying out are harvesting and weeding and plowing, right? These are not activities for which we can think that schooling is going to have a high return. Okay, so it seems like going in, it's a reasonable assumption that these kinds of non-skill manual labor jobs are not going to be benefited by schooling, but we'll look to see. Yeah. And of course, it's not obvious that schooling is going to augment profitability, and we have to worry there about reverse causation as well, which is that it could just be that wealthier farmers invest in schooling because they like schooling, and so you get a relationship between profitability and schooling. That's the reverse causation. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to identify the male in each of the farm households from the ICRSAT data who has the highest level of schooling. So we're not using the head schooling. Oftentimes the head is just the oldest person, the oldest male in the household. And, because of cohort effects, he normally doesn't have the highest level of schooling. And if schooling is going to provide, information and ability to augment ability to allocate resources, you're clearly going to listen to the person who's better at it, which in principle should be the person with the highest skill, the highest level of schooling. And in earlier work, we've found that to always dominate the head schooling. Okay. So we divided up the schooling into primary schooling and secondary schooling and above. And that's going to correspond to what we have for public school construction, which is primary and secondary as well. So I talked about the challenge of reverse causation, but there's also a challenge that there's selectivity of who works in the wage labor market. We're going to be looking at the same people. So we're going to take the max schooling person, male, from these farm households, and we're going to look at the effects of their schooling on their farm profitability. And for the same people who work in the wage labor market, which of course is a selective sample, we're going to look at the effect of that schooling on their wages in that market. So we're going to have to take into account the selectivity, because only 24% of those farmers with max schooling actually worked in the wage labor market. We're going to control for, again, the land quality variables. We're going to control for land rental value, which basically summarizes the land, and that's the properties of the land. That's going to capture the main component of wealth, of course, but not farmer-specific abilities, including schooling. Right? Again, there's no reason for rent for land that someone is willing to pay to reflect the schooling of the person who happens to own the land. To deal with selectivity, for the wage returns, we're going to implement a control function approach. And it's pretty obvious what's going to identify that. Basically, the farm characteristics, the size of the land, the quality of the land, and and schooling are going to affect whether or not a person works in the market. And what we should see is sort of a revealed preference of the differential effects of schooling on profitability in farming and on wages, is that the more schooled is the farmer, the less likely he is to work for wages, controlling for farm size and everything else, right? Because he gets a much higher return from that schooling in farming. So what do we find? Okay, let's look at the data. So we have log real output per acre, real profits per acre, and we have whether or not the person is in the wage labor market. That's our selectivity equation. And then we have the dependent variable as the log of the real hourly wage, since we're using multiple 6 years of data. Okay, so just looking at OLS, we have, again, village year fixed effects to control for prices and for weather changes. We don't have the land quality variables. And we get that the secondary school farmer gets 37% higher output per acre compared to an illiterate farmer, and 27% more output per acre than the farmer who has only primary schooling. When we control for land quality, it really doesn't change the estimates in any significant way. When we look at profits per acre, we get the same results, which is that primary schooling has no significant effect on profits per acre. It's only secondary schooling. And the results say that going from primary schooling to secondary schooling increases the profitability by 71%. What we find, oh, sorry, that's wrong. Sorry, secondary schooling increases profitability by 15%, not 71%. Okay, and has no effect of being primary schooled. When we look at the determinants of the wage labor market, what it says is that a farmer who has secondary schooling compared to a farmer who has primary schooling is 71% less likely to be in the wage labor market. Okay, so it's a big effect. So it's showing that secondary schooling has a significant effect on profits per acre and output per acre. And those guys with the higher level of with secondary schooling are much less likely to participate in the wage labor market, again, controlling for the size of land holdings, et cetera. Okay. When we take into account selectivity, or even if we don't, there's absolutely no positive relationship between either primary or secondary schooling and the log of the real hourly wage. And we don't see much evidence of selectivity on unobservables either, because the notion that there's skill bias doesn't make sense if skill is not being rewarded in these tasks. Okay, so it's pretty clear, both by the behavior of these farmers and by the evidence we get from the profit function and from the hourly wage results, that schooling, secondary schooling, benefits the landed and not the landless. If we, what are we doing here? We're replacing the land quality by rent, and we get basically the same results. It's not important. We can also look at the REDS data at agricultural wage workers, and we find again that primary schooling has no effect, and neither does secondary schooling. And we can do both village fixed effects and even household fixed effects. We can compare men in the same household with different levels of schooling to see what happens to their wages. Okay, so in both data sets, there's just no evidence that agricultural wages are pushed up by the schooling of the individuals. Okay. Now, another hypothesis you might have is that what schooling does, it may not affect the wages in the local labor market, but it might facilitate outmigration. Now, in the 1999 REDS, we collected information on all of the immediate relatives of the head. The information provided was where the individuals who were related to the head were residing at the time of the survey. So we know precisely who left the villages. Okay. We're going to look at the sons aged 20 to 59 of the heads of households in the 1999 REDS round. Okay. And when we look at them, we find that 16% of the landed sons in that age group had left the village, and 16.7% of the landless sons had left the village at the time of the survey. The question we want to know is, did that have anything to do with the schooling attainment? Okay. So we're going to look at the effects of primary and secondary schooling on whether any son had left the village by 1999. Okay. And these are the results divided up into landed and landless households. We can do this with household fixed effects. We can compare the probability of the son leaving the household by schooling level across sons in the household for both landless and landless households. There is no relationship. Schooling simply does not matter for whether they leave. Okay, so that's not a return for the landless or the landed for that matter either. Okay.
So could I ask,
Yep,
there's
sure.
a question in the chat box,
Okay.
which is asking why you've clustered your standard errors at the household level and not at the village level.
We actually can do it. Is that what we say we did?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because we have multiple members of the household. So that's certainly one valid cluster. I've done this before. This is ongoing work, and we probably go to a 2-level. We're going to have a 2-level household and village cluster.
Okay.
So the household cluster is because we have multiple members of households, right, who clearly have a common shock. And I think that's the most important one. But we'll do both. It's obvious, if you think that these standard errors are too small, right, it's certainly not going to result in the standard errors becoming giving us statistically significant results for the wages. But it's a good point. Okay, electrification. So in principle, the supply of electricity to a village can benefit everybody, like streetlights or being able to plug in a television set. But in the 82 round, there was information provided at the village level on the use of electrification. Okay, and this is what it shows: is that the fraction of villages for which electrification was predominantly benefiting households was 80%. That's not a surprise. Okay, so this is villages that were electrified. Okay, in over 60%, the electrification was used for streetlights, 60% for agriculture, and a relatively small amount for industry. The point being that agriculture is benefiting, and that's of course mostly for pump irrigation as well. So you could argue that the streetlights were benefiting everyone, but the use of electricity for agriculture was particularly benefiting, and let's suppose it was for mostly irrigation, was principally aiding the landed households, but not so much the landless households. But even when we look within households, within the villages, we see that across households within villages that were electrified, we find that almost 70% of landed households were actually hooked up to the grid, while only a little over 40% of landless households were hooked up. So again, for whatever reason, maybe the landed households can better afford to pay the bills for electrification to the extent that they're enforced, or whether they have a higher demand for electricity because they can afford the consumer goods that make use of electricity, like television sets. Nevertheless, it's pretty clear that the landed households benefit more from electrification than the landless households, both because of the use of electrification for irrigation purposes and because they tend to use it more for consumption purposes. Yeah. So finally, we have employment programs. We don't have to do our own work here. We have the wonderful randomized controlled trial that was carried out by Emily Brise and Supreet Raut. And what they found is when they actually created an employment program for a village, for a set of villages, compared the treatment and control villages during the Kharif season, they found absolutely that the employment programs increased wages. Okay. So the employment programs definitely are something that would be favored by landless households. And to the extent that the landed households are net hirers of labor, that point that was made before, they are going to be discouraging such programs. Okay, so now we're ready to look at the effects of democratization on public goods composition. Our dependent variables are the programs. On the right-hand side, we have whether the village had become democratized, that's D, and then the interaction of democratization with the fraction of the village that is landless. We also have to include the total land of the village, because that was always a fixed component in the comparative statics. Interacted with democracy. You don't see A there because it's a fixed component of the villages, because we have a village fixed effect, we have time fixed effects, and we also, which we don't show there, we also allow there to be village specific time trends in the variables. Okay. And we have state year fixed effects as well. I mentioned we're going to use the initial landless share for the reasons that we don't want the landless share to be affected by democratization. Okay. And of course, we're going to be concerned that the timing of democracy is not random, and we're going to use as instruments the amendments that are interacted with each other and with the fraction landless. And I want to show you some graphs to show that this makes sense. Okay, to focus on the initial landless. So this is an event history diagram. Okay, what we show is on the left-hand side of the zero is we have years preceding the democratization of the village. And on the right-hand side, we have years since democratization. And here we're looking at the effects of the stage 2 policy. Okay, so this is the stage 2 policy year. And when we can see there is a discontinuity and a shift in the trends, right? It's just not a continuation of the same trend. And it looks like, in fact, there's some lag between the stage 2 amendments and whether the village became democratized. So let me be clear, because I misstated something at the beginning here. So the zero is when the amendment came into effect. Okay, and the left-hand side is the years before the amendment, what was happening to democracy in the villages. And what you can see is the villages with a higher landless share, the red, were already more democratized than the villages that had a below median landless share. But then after the amendment, the second stage amendment, then there was an advance in the trend in the landless versus the landed medium villages. The results are more stark when we look at the third stage amendment. Okay, so there's clearly a discontinuity, a shift up that's differential by the initial share of the landless. Before there was a trend upward, before the stage 3 amendments were put into effect for both the landed and landless households, again, not households, villages. The high landless villages were again more democratized, but after that amendment went into effect, there was a much bigger jump up for those villages. Okay, so it looks like the identification strategy has some basis in the fundamental data that we see. We'll also test for F-stats, of course. Okay, and all right, so here's the results. Okay. So we're using the time series from 71 to 99. We're clustering at the village level. The elected panchayat, the panchayat interacted with the landless share. And what you see from these estimates is that for the programs that our data suggests are favored by the landed, irrigation, electrification, secondary schools, the higher the fraction of the landless, well, first, going to democracy leads to more of those things, but the effect of democratization is lower and might even be negative, the higher the proportion of the village that's landed, just as we would expect. Okay. When we move to employment programs, we get the opposite. Democratization, the linear term is negative, but the interaction term is positive. So the higher the landless share when we shift to democracy, the more likely we are to see employment programs. Let's quantify these results. Okay, let's take 3 scenarios. One is when, based on these estimates, when rho is equal to 0, that is a case in which the landed completely determine then the allocation of public goods or the composition of public goods. Another scenario is we set rho to be 0.6, so that the landless have a clear majority. And then we'll also look at the results at the means of rho, okay? All of these simulations will be done at the mean of the land sizes of these villages, okay? Well, oh, before I do that, well, we have a robustness check for doing this staggered shifts in democratization over time with the fixed effects, the sort of two-way fixed effects. There's always the concern that the democratization effects are not time invariant, and that can lead to biased estimates. This is now well known. So what we're going to do is we're going to instead just look at the effects within the first 5 years of a democratization, which corresponds to one term length for an elected panchayat, and then have dummy out the effects after 5 years. So we're going to only be interested in the first 5 year effects. And when we look at that, the coefficients for the first 5 year effects, not the after, they're basically the same as we get in the other estimates where we don't differentiate the two effects. So that doesn't seem to be a concern. All right, so let's look at the simulations for the three cases. Rho is 0, rho is 0.6, rho is at the mean. Okay, so we have landed in control. What is the effect of democratization? We find that democratization increases the probability of an irrigation work program by 0.2, increases the electrification by 0.25, secondary schools by 0.18, and reduces the probability that there's employment programs. So that's what happens when we shift from autocracy, when we have landed in control, okay? Or if there's elite capture of democratization. When the landless have a majority, we get just the opposite. We get that there's less likely to be an irrigation work program, less likely to be electrification, less likely to be a public secondary school, but much more likely to be employment programs. And then at the means, we get a mixed picture, right? Because there's no one group is dominating. At the mean, it tends to be that the landed have a bigger share. And you get the same results when we look at the within 5 year effects. Right, so that just summarizes that. Now, I said that we also have outcomes, not just programs. Now we only have these for both the census data and for the REDS round, 71, 82, 99, and what's not listed here for roads for the 91 census. Okay, but we're going to do the same thing. So at most, we're going to have 3 observations for the irrigation assets and schooling and other outcomes. So we're going to have far less power to do this. But in some sense, we have some very interesting, maybe more interesting dependent variables. Okay, so we have, first of all, actual existence of public wells and public pumps. We have the share of irrigated land. We have actual school enrollments, and we have the relative consumption of landed versus landless. Okay, and what we find here is evidence that is consistent with what we saw for the programs, that for irrigation assets and for irrigation in general, the interaction term is negative with landless. And it's negative for school enrollment too, because remember, there was less building of secondary schools. On the other hand, the higher the proportion landless, the greater the ratio of the landless consumption to landed consumption. When we look at these effects for the various scenarios, we find, again, when the landed are in control, there's more wells and pumps and the higher share of land irrigated. By the way, the fact that there's a higher share of land irrigated suggests that there's not perfect substitution between public irrigation and private irrigation, right? Because it does push up the total amount of irrigation. There's more school enrollment, and the landed are benefiting relative to the landless. When the landless are in the majority, we get exactly the opposite. The landless benefit relative to the landed, and they're shutting down all of the infrastructure programs. The third column is very interesting. In the third column, what it says is at the means, you find actually no effect of democratization. Okay, so if someone was just running a linear specification and not paying attention to the variation across villages and interest groups, they would conclude that there's no effect of democracy on any of the composition of these public goods, okay? Which is sort of a main point of this paper, which is that the effects of democracy depend on interest groups. Okay, I mentioned that there are roads. We don't have any predictions as to for road building with respect to democratization and the relevance of the shares. When we do the same scenarios, we find that in fact, when the landed are in control, there's less roads. And when the landless are in control, there's more roads. And we can make up stories about why that's true, but we find that. So let me point out that it's not necessarily true that if there's a landless in majority, that all infrastructure is at a lower level compared to the landed. So what are the conclusions here? It looks like the de jure democratization, the so-called democratization of villages in India, appears to actually have democratized, because what we find is that there is a clear move in the direction from influence by the landed to having more influence by the landless. Secondly, that neither aristocratic rule by the landed in this case, nor democracy, which gives more weight to the landless, delivers a composition of public goods that maximizes income. And in fact, it's not clear which of these regimes comes closer to maximizing output. And the third one is the point I made just earlier, is that the effects of democratization are heterogeneous and they depend on a number of factors. And let me just highlight what those factors are that the model and the data suggest. First, what happens to the composition of public goods, and therefore what happens to income and growth, is going to depend on the existence of groups with differing economic interests. They could be ethnic groups, they could be economic groups, they could be religious groups. But if there are groups with different group interests, that's going to matter for what democracy or democratization does. It's also going to matter how much mobility there is between groups. If people don't strongly identify with a particular group because they see that later in life they have an opportunity to be in another group, then there are more diffused interests in the economy. Obviously, it's going to depend on how disparate the interests are of the different groups. It's going to depend on the relative size of the groups, which means it will probably be related to inequality. In the two groups that we use, there's a very clear correlation between inequality and the share landless. The landless are clearly poorer than the landed. And if there's more of them, there's more poverty and there's more inequality, because remember, the higher the proportion landless means the greater the land holdings of the landed. So the fact that we find that shifts in the landless fraction affect the composition of public goods is saying that inequality is a major feature of an economy that's going to play a big role in what democracy does. Okay. And the third factor that matters is whether the benefits from productivity enhancing public goods, how they affect the different groups, the trickle-down issue. So the answer to the question of whether democratization increases growth is, as I said, it depends. And these are some of the factors it depends on. My time is up.
Yes, that's true. So, would you want to take a clarificatory question at the end?
I'm perfectly happy to take questions. I'm perfectly happy to go on, but I'm just worried about the progress of the meeting, right? Because there's some other activity. So you control that and you stop when you think that we need to. But I'm happy to consider questions, noting that in about half an hour, right, or so, we're going to have an open session for questions.
Yes, so that may be a better forum, especially because this what you've just presented is fascinating, and we've just heard you. So I'm sure there are a bunch of questions, and if we start now, maybe that's not such a good idea. So we could wait for about half an hour. But let me then sort of close this session by saying that we were very happy that you accepted to be one of our distinguished speakers this year. Of course, we would have greatly preferred an offline. We would have greatly preferred to host you in person.
Absolutely.
But
I would have preferred it for sure.
C'est la vie.
Yes.
So we miss those sort of counterfactual lunches and dinner and drinks.
Absolutely, yes.
But having said that, it was just great to have you here and give 3 fascinating talks, including this one, which I don't think any of us, well, let me speak for myself. I haven't seen this as a paper anywhere. And it's fascinating, especially if you sort of juxtapose it against the sort of more macro, for instance, the Acemoglu, Naidu, Restrepo and Robinson kind of work that we've seen in JP, etc. But I'm sure there'll be lots to talk about in the breakout session, which will be about a half hour from now. So that's 10:30 Indian time and 12 noon US Eastern time, right? And for completeness, I guess 5 in the evening Greenwich Mean Time. All right. So we'll see all of you. So thanks a lot, Professor Rosenzweig.
Thank you.
Yeah.
A couple of announcements. So number one, the validatory session is at 10:15 and it will run for about 15 minutes. And Professor so those who are interested in the breakout session have already been sent a invitation with the link. You please join us at 10:30 at that link and not at this link. This link will be still on for the valedictory and award announcement session. Okay, so we will meet at this link at 10:15.
Fine.
Yeah. IT team, please note that Professor Dilip Mukherjee will be joining us. So whenever he joins, please make him a co-host. Dilip has joined. So let's make him a co-host.
Okay, sir.
Okay. Okay.
Yes, Professor Dilip has joined.
Hello, this is Dilip. I can't turn on my video.
Okay.
It says, because the host is not allowing it.
Yeah. IT team, please, can you Professor Mukherjee, can you try? Yeah.
Yeah,
Good.
okay, got it.
There you are. Loud and clear.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Everything went well?
I think so. I think Shomendu had more hands-on experience of the school than I did.
Yeah. So the invited sessions went on really well, and we had lots of interaction during the breakout sessions as well. So this time we had a lot of opportunity to have a conversation with the invited speakers. So right after this session is over, we are going to speak with Mark.
Yeah.
So.
And how long will this session last? How long should I stay?
Well, I think if we start at 10:15, we should be able to wrap up by 10:30.
Okay,
so,
15 minutes.
Yeah, it should be quick.
Yeah.
And what was the fraction of students from Indian universities amongst the participants?
We will give you the exact numbers, but well, we had many participants this time. So the number of registered participants went well above 1,000.
I think a lot of them were probably watching on YouTube or recordings or stuff like that.
Lots of views on YouTube as well.
Now just one item of curiosity. I guess this is an outcome of Zoom, of the Zooming of the conference. But what consequences does it have for the opportunity for students from, let's say, the South Asian subcontinent to join and participate? I mean, are they getting? Do you have any sense that there may be any crowding out?
Well, I think we had a lot of participation from the subcontinent, and in particular in the papers that were presented. So I would say about 30-35% were papers which are not from the subcontinent, submissions, and the rest of them were from the subcontinent.
Okay, so 65% from the subcontinent.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's my hunch when I saw the paper.
Yeah, I think we have to look at the data carefully.
I mean, one thing that's happened, I guess, is it's become more like a conference and less like a school, except for the fact that the four invited speakers give these state-of-the-art lectures and interact with the students.
Right.
Yeah.
The character of the school has changed quite enormously from 20 years back, let's say.
Yes.
20 years back, there was no conference part of the school. Only each of the invited speakers was asked to give detailed comments on someone's thesis or some kind of advanced research work by a student. Some of my colleagues have benefited from these kinds of comments in the past, but now it's become more like a regular conference. Short talks. I think the happy mean lies somewhere in between. I don't think.
Right. I mean, you have to
20-minute
you have to be
conference.
aware. It could be a slippery slope, and it just becomes more like a conference.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things we are struggling with is defining the boundary between a conference and a school. And in fact, we denied the Latin Americans were essentially organizing conferences, and we actually said no, those are not schools. And uh, anyway, just wanted you to be aware of that.
Okay, Sudhir, you may please begin the proceedings of the valedictory session.
Okay.
So welcome everyone. So we have Chair of the Organizing Committee, Professor Sudhir Shah, Professor Dilip Mukherjee, South Asia Chairman of the Econometrics Society, Professor Swendar Kumar, who is our head of the Department of Economics at the Delhi School of Economics, our fellow colleagues and presenters, participants, award nominees, and volunteers, and our IT team, staff team, everyone, welcome. Warm welcome. Sudhir, please.
Thank you, Somendu. Good evening or good morning, as the case might be. It has fallen upon me to thank all our wonderful speakers and bid everyone farewell. The latter thought is not a mere formality in these times. Let me start by appreciating the invited speakers, Typhon Sonmez, Michael Woodford, Whitney Nui, and Mark Rosenzweig, for being extraordinarily prompt and gracious in accepting our invitation, reviewing the prize papers in time, and most importantly, delivering such insightful and well-crafted lectures. The only regret is that we could not bring them to Delhi to do these lectures. Perhaps we'll get an opportunity to welcome them here in the future. Let me also thank all the scholars who gave the contributed talks. The papers were of extremely high standard, and it was evident that the themes reflected the evolving concerns and styles within the discipline. I should perhaps say a word about the procedure employed to select the papers for presentation and the best paper prizes. The papers for presentation were selected on the basis of referee evaluations by our own faculty. The referees also flagged papers that had the potential for being shortlisted for the prizes. The four organizers, myself included, further evaluated the candidates for the prizes and created a shortlist for each broadly conceived category. So the categories were microeconomics, macroeconomics, econometrics, and applied/development economics. These categories roughly match the areas of our invited speakers. I should mention that we deliberately did not consider for shortlisting papers that had an established senior scholar as a co-author. The shortlisted papers in each category were sent to the relevant invited speaker, who selected the prize paper in that category. I should also thank all the participants who attended the sessions for being very attentive and participating actively in the paper discussions. It is appropriate at this time to thank the Econometrics Society for being great partners in organizing the school as part of an international effort to reach out to young scholars. Our liaison with the society is Dilip Mukherjee. Welcome back to DSE, Dilip. He has been extraordinarily creative and sensitive to our concerns while navigating this relationship. His advice and assistance in many matters is highly appreciated. I should also thank Lynn Hogan in the society office, who has always responded to our questions and requests with prompt and graceful responses. I think Napoleon said that an army marches on its stomach. Similarly, we march on the generous funds provided by our sponsors, namely the Exim Bank and an unnameable sponsor who wishes to stay anonymous. Both the sponsors have supported the Winter School for 2 decades or more. The Winter School is simply impossible without their support. Long may they prosper and continue to support this endeavor. Finally, let me thank all those who contributed to the success of the schools in various other capacities. First, let me thank all my colleagues who did the refereeing work, sorting out the papers. Secondly, the staff of the Center for Development Economics who helped with the back office work and the IT systems. So thank you, Deepika, Raju, Sonveer, and Rityunjay. our one-man research assistance team who manage and maintain all the records and the files. So thank you, Adarsh Upadhyay. And finally, our team of volunteers. So thank you, Anjali, Gayatri, Lavanya, Akash, Kaustab, Mukta, and Vasundhara. So let me conclude by again thanking everyone and bidding you farewell. I'll now hand you over to Dilip Mukherjee, who I understand will announce the best paper prizes. Dilip.
Thank you, Sudhir. Yeah, before I announce the winners of the Best Paper Awards, let me just take a minute to just express my deep admiration and thanks to the Delhi School of Economics for a fantastic winter school, following on many previously successful winter schools. I was a student at the Delhi School a long time ago, and I very much wish I had the benefit of participating in schools like this and the opportunity to interact with outstanding scholars of the likes of the four invited speakers this year, Professor Sonmez, Woodford, Newey, and Rosenzweig. Thank you all for devoting so much time and effort to nurturing young talent, not only in South Asia, but as it turns out, with the thanks to COVID and Zoom and all that, to young people across the entire world. I believe there were papers that were nominated, selected by members of the organizing committee in the four areas: micro, macro, econometrics, and development. And then the invited speakers chose from amongst those in their respective field. So let me now announce the winners. In each category, there were 4 or 5 nominated papers. So let me just, I don't have time enough to announce all the nominations. Let me just announce the name of the awards. So first, microeconomics. The winner is a paper called Crowding in School Choice by Yu Zhao, Kyoto University, William Fan, North Carolina State University, and Ryan Tierney, University of Southern Denmark. Congratulations. In macroeconomics, the winner is paper with the title Solving Heterogeneous Agent Models with the Master Equation by Adrian Bellal, University of Chicago. Congratulations, Adrian. Econometrics. The winning paper is Wild Bootstrap for Instrumental Variable Regressions with Weak and Few Clusters by Wenji Wang of Nanyang Technological University and Yichong Zhang of the Singapore Management University. And finally, Applied/Development Economics. The winner is Paid Work for Women and Domestic Violence, Evidence from the Rwandan Coffee Mills by Dennis Sanin from Georgetown University. Congratulations, Dennis. So that concludes the list of award winners in the 4 categories. Again, thanks very much for your sustained engagement and participation, and congratulations to the award winners.
Congratulations.
So, colleagues, good evening, good morning, as the case may be, to everyone. And let me thank the organizing committee. And in the last year, when we were formulating this organizing committee, we were slightly late in the beginning. And then I approached Sudhir in the beginning. And I get a great relief when Sudhir accepted my request. And under the leadership of Professor Sudhir Sir, we have this team consisting Professor Anirban Kar, Professor Pramjit, and Dr. Somendu Sarkar. And all 4 of you as a team did a great, wonderful job. And I think without any error, that's a great success. So I really thanks to you all individually as well as collectively. Also, I would like to thank Professor Dilip Mukherjee for taking this partnership between Econometric Society and the Delhi School of Economics. This is the second round of this partnership, and we hope this will continue. And lastly, I would like to congratulate all the winners and all the participants. I thank them because without their participation, it can never happen. So thanks a lot to you all. And now I request all the participants, those who wants to join this breakout session of Mark Wiswick.
May I also request everyone to switch on their cameras? IT team, can you please take a screenshot of everyone who is present here? IT team. IT team, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we are hearing you.
Yeah, please take a screenshot of everyone who is present on the screens. Maybe there are too many participants. You have to take all photos here. I can see Professor Whitney and Professor Typhoon has also joined us. Thank you for joining us. And thanks for helping us with the selection of the award winners. Let us know when you have clicked the pictures so I can. Okay, so I guess that's it.
Done? Okay.
Yeah, thanks once again. And please join us at 10:30 p.m. IST on the link which is given for the breakout session with Professor Mark Rosenzweig. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
I guess the lights go out now.
So thanks, Sudhir.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Surinder. Bye.